Selamat siang, Bapak dan Ibu
Good
peserta.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the webinar. Thank you very much for participating in today's workshop. Our webinar today titled Reform in Goods and Service Procurement, Challenges and Solution, jointly organized by UNODC and the UK Embassy in Jakarta to celebrate the International Anti-Corruption Day, which will fall tomorrow on the 9th of December. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Owen Jenkins, Ambassador of UK for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Mr. Collie Brown, Country Manager of UNODC, Indonesia and ASEAN, Deputy for Monitoring and Evaluation and Control of the National Development Planning Agency. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. Before I start, I would like to brief you about our agenda today.
Kegiatan webinar hari ini akan dimulai dengan
We will begin with an opening remark from the UK Embassy and UNODC Indonesia, which will be followed by a keynote speech, which will be delivered by the Bappenas representatives on Indonesian government strategy and priority on public procurement reform in Indonesia, which will be delivered by Mr. Taufik Hanafi. And then after that, we will have a panel discussion with several speakers, including Bapak Heidra Ali and Ibu Sarah Sadika. And for the next session, we will be listening to the response from Mr. Francisco Keki from UK Government Delivery Partner in Indonesia, Mr. Francisco Keki from UNODC, Warren Smith from UK Government Digital Services, Tom Townsend from Open Ownership, and Bernardine France from Open Contracting Partnership. And after that, we will have a question and answer session and the closing session. So let's just go directly to the first remark. I would like to invite His Excellency Ambassador of UK to Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ambassador Owen Jenkins. The screen is yours.
Terima kasih banyak Mbak Putri. Selamat siang dan selamat datang ke semua
Good
hadirin.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. To this important event, I would like to apologize because I will speak in English to deliver my remarks because my Indonesian is only enough for daily use, but not for important issues like anti-corruption.
Welcome to this important seminar and thank you for joining us today for this discussion of the important issue of the Public Procurement Reform Agenda in Indonesia and the challenges and solutions which the government of Indonesia is seeking with support and work together with its international partners. I'd like to express particular thanks to Mr. Collie Brown, the Country Director of UNODC, for joining us, Bapak Dr. Taufik Hanafi, Deputy for Monitoring, Evaluation and Control of Bappenas, Ibu Sarah Sadika, Deputy for Strategy and Policy Development, LKPP, Bapak Herda Helmijaya, Daily Coordinator of National Strategy for Corruption Prevention Team at KPK. Also, I'd like to welcome Mr. Warren Smith from the UK Government Digital Service, Mr. Francesco Cecchi from UNODC, Ms. Bernadine Ferns from the Open Contracting Partnership, and Mr. Tom Townsend from Open Ownership. Thank you all for joining us, and perhaps even more importantly, thank you to everybody else who is here, all the participants and those involved in this important agenda, and I look forward to the discussion today. As Mbak Putri has already mentioned, tomorrow is International Anti-Corruption Day, and it was on that day in 2003 that 140 countries came together to sign the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC. There are now 187 parties who have ratified that convention. And they've done so because corruption is genuinely one of the greatest obstacles to the challenges which we all face around the world of economic and social development. It lies at the heart of many of the common problems that we face. And it does so for a range of reasons. It does so because it's a threat to individual businesses. It can raise the costs to companies by up to 10%. That distorts markets, it puts off trade and investment, and it puts off companies from engaging in new markets. Worldwide, the cost of corruption is estimated to be more than 2% of global GDP. Corruption is also a threat to our efforts to reduce poverty. It diverts vital funds from essential services such as schools, roads, and hospitals. And far too often, corruption hits the poorest and the most vulnerable the hardest. The COVID-19 pandemic this year has really shone a spotlight on the importance of addressing corruption worldwide, even more so than in previous years. And I think that adds even greater significance to this year's International Anti-Corruption Day. The United Kingdom has developed clear national and international priorities through our work on this area, and they're set out in our anti-corruption strategy, which runs from 2017 to 2022. And importantly, it includes our commitment to work with our international partners who share our desire to address these important issues. We're very proud to be working alongside the UNODC, the Government Digital Service, the Open Contracting Partnership, and Open Ownership to drive forward the implementation in collaboration with the Government of Indonesia of our Global Anti-Corruption Programme, working in collaboration on our shared priorities to address and prevent corruption. Our work here in Indonesia is very much in support of the government's projects and initiatives. And the issues at the heart of that, including public procurement and beneficial ownership reform, are taking on ever greater importance and focus within our programme as key strands of an effective corruption prevention strategy. Our Global Digital Marketplace programme, which Mr. Warren Smith will talk about later, is using UK technology and methodologies to open up the government procurement market and increase the transparency of process by introducing a digital marketplace for the procurement of certain services. Projects such as the simplification of public procurement documents are providing practical support for the reforms that LKPP are leading, and we hope that they can be built on and developed moving forward. As I've said, beneficial ownership is another area of focus within our programme. Collectively pursuing beneficial ownership transparency as a global norm is something which we believe has the potential to deliver a wide range of benefits, both in countries and across borders, including tackling corruption, tackling money laundering, potentially tackling terrorist financing, as well as other illicit financial flows, as the risks of detection of those illicit flows are increased if we all have better access to high quality information and our law enforcement and civil society can see where that beneficial ownership lies. It also has the potential to improve the business environment through improving trust, levelling the playing field, and promoting more open competition. We also believe that it can help address tax evasion, as tax authorities can better understand the real interests and the underlying ownership structures of corporate and individual taxpayers. On beneficial ownership reform, which is something that we prioritised in UK legislation in recent years, we were very struck to see that 5 ministries within the government of Indonesia have signed an MOU in June 2019 with the aim of improving the sharing of beneficial ownership information. We're very keen through our programme to support Indonesia in technical capacity building linked to this, such as reforms of data and systems within the Ministry of Law and Human Rights to create a basis for further technical advice and support, as well as research into options and opportunities for a system of sharing of beneficial ownership data between different bodies and across government agencies. I'm delighted to be in the company of such distinguished experts and subject specialists here today as we seek to talk through that range of topics and share best practice, as well as address areas for future development in preventing corruption, particularly in public procurement. I very much look forward to hearing from everybody represented here today about how we can address those common challenges together and build on the steps that we've already taken. Thank you once again to everybody, fellow speakers and in the audience for coming today. I look forward to hearing from all of you about how we can address the real and central importance of anti-corruption efforts. And I hope you enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Owen Jenkins. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. I think today's webinar will be so relevant with today's situation when we are facing the COVID-19 pandemic. And without further ado again, I would like to welcome Mr. Collie Brown, the UNODC Country Manager and Liaison to ASEAN. Mr. Collie Brown, the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Putri, and let me add my welcome to all of you. Excellency Mr. Owen Jenkins, the Ambassador of the UK for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, as well as Mr. Taufik Hanafi, the Deputy for Monitoring, Evaluation and Control Development at Bappenas. As well, I do want to acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Francesco Cecchi, our UNODC's Regional Advisor for Anti-Corruption, and as well, you, Putri, Ms. Putri Rijayanti, our Program Coordinator for Anti-Corruption in UNODC Indonesia, and as well, my good friend, Mr. Chris Agas, the lead for anti-corruption and digital access at the UK Embassy. And certainly all the distinguished presenters has that been recognized by the ambassador, including Ms. Ibu Sarah Sadiqa, for Deputy for Strategy and Policy Development at the National Public Procurement Agency, LKPP, and all the other distinguished presenters hearing from. Thanks to all of you for being with us this afternoon. You know, for a variety of reasons, tomorrow's observation of International Anti-Corruption Day will be especially significant. Of course, it's occurring in the climate of the ongoing pandemic, where billions in various currencies are being made available in extraordinary manner by public and private sectors to stem and to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on the lives of millions of people. The target of much of this assistance are the most vulnerable and those hardest hit by the pandemic. In that context, in taking these emergency measures and in the disbursement of these resources, many states have relaxed their procurement and other anti-corruption safeguards by trading compliance, oversight, accountability for speed of responses and achievement of rapid impact to save lives. Unfortunately, this has created significant opportunities for corruption as we've never seen before. As the world is recovering from this pandemic, countries need to also address these weaknesses. Embezzlement, bribes, price gouging are only a few of the corrupt practices we are seeing proliferating in essential sectors. Many countries are adopting a pay now, check later approach in providing critical financial resources to businesses who are impacted, which are impacted by COVID-19. However, the risk and the occurrences of abuse of these emergency grants by companies not entitled to them, also the creation of fake companies to benefit from the situation, and the entry, of course, of organized crime elements into legitimate business or impersonating companies increasing at an alarming level. Equally at risk is the recovery from the pandemic, and which will require a robust procurement system and anti-corruption measures permeating every aspect of services and the institutions charged with them. Now more than ever, also, the need for strong anti-corruption regimes are required. In Indonesia, agencies like KPK and LKPP must play a leading role in responding to these bad actors. The confidence of the public in these agencies must be unwavering. Perceptions, real or unreal, that these agencies may lack the independence and the intestinal fortitude to aggressively carry out their mandate without fear or favor must be dispelled by the actions they take. I am encouraged, however, by recent actions by KPK, where status and position in government has not diminished their efforts to hold persons accountable. Of course, one recent case involving COVID-19 recovery money shows the importance of beneficial ownership transparency to prevent conflicts of interest in public procurement. At the same time, legal processes must go forward with full transparency to ensure that due process is afforded to those who are accused. These steps will build the confidence of the public and put on notice those criminals who may want to profit, that they will be held accountable. And so tomorrow's event not only will mark the observation of this very important day, but hopefully will serve to recommit and redouble our efforts to combat the corruption scourge that robs Indonesia of precious resources and undermines its effort to provide needed services to those who need them the most. I'm looking forward to hearing more about these efforts that are being undertaken in Indonesia with the support of our various national and international partners, to include UNODC and such things as enhancing transparency in beneficial ownership and key reforms of the public procurement systems in Indonesia. So thank you very much for the attention and look forward to the rest of the event. Thank you. Over to you, Putri.
Thank you, Collie. Thank you for your opening remarks. Thank you, dear Excellencies. Thank you for your opening remarks and participation to this webinar in your busy time. And Mr. Ambassador and UNODC Country Manager may not be with us for the whole 2 hours, but any question regarding the work of UK and UNODC on anti-corruption programs in Indonesia could be addressed to Mr. Christopher Agas, Anti-Corruption and Digital Access Lead, British Embassy Jakarta, and Mr. Francesco Cecchi, Advisor of Anti-Corruption Program, Regional Office, UNODC. So,
and Putri, I'm going to stay as long as I can. I mean, this is such an important topic that I'm going to stay on as long at the risk of canceling some of the stuff that I have pending. So please proceed.
Thank you so much, Pa. I'm really delighted to have you here. So, Pa Taufik Hanafi.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to invite you. I would like to invite you as the keynote speaker. I believe your insights, your views, and advice on what is the government strategy and priority on the procurement reform agenda in Indonesia. The time and the screen is yours, Pa. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I also want to share screen later. Your Excellency, Bapak Owen Jenkins, British Ambassador to Indonesia and Timor-Leste. And Your Excellency, Bapak Collie Brown, UNODC Country Manager and Liaison to ASEAN. Thank you for wearing batik, Pak. You look great. Distinguished panelists, my fellow panelists and moderator, distinguished participants, and also I want to say in Bahasa, the last one is insan pemerhati gerakan anti korupsi.
Anti-corruption activists, and observers.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat
Peace
sore,
be upon us all. Good
sejahtera
afternoon
kita semua.
and greetings everyone. Om Swastiastu.
I would like to start by thanking the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes and also British Embassy Jakarta for organizing this very important event. I'm also delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this webinar discussion to celebrating International Anti-Corruption Day. Yeah. And of course, the main theme of this webinar is focusing on the Public Procurement Reform Agenda in Indonesia is in line with the spirit of the Global Anti-Corruption Conference team organized by IACC, shaping the 2030 agenda of truth, trust, and transparency, ensuring that the fight against corruption is at the center of the post-pandemic world. I also like to welcome the stakeholders and my fellow panelists today from KPK, from LKPP, and also experts from government, private sectors, and also academia, who will discuss and share important challenges, lessons learned, solution, and effort to fight against corruption through open exchange of views. As mentioned by, clearly stated by Excellency, British Ambassador, a few minutes ago, Government of Indonesia's commitment for eradicating and preventing corruption is very clear. Medium-term development plan 2020 to 2024 has rightly outlined the policy directions of the endeavor, and the policy direction has been translated into presidential regulations on a national strategy for corruption prevention. The national team to execute the strategies consisting of Ministry of Planning, Bappenas, Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Administrative and Bureaucratic Reform, and also KPK and Presidential Secretariat Office. So I think we have very strong team to execute the national strategy. As a strengthening procurement system and e-governments are important elements for a strategy of corruption prevention and eradication in Indonesia. So in order to support the effort, the government has committed to strengthen bureaucracy reform and accelerate the digital transformation. I'm very pleased that one of our speakers will discuss about the technology, as Ambassador mentioned, to how to deal with this very important issue. So the digital transformation, including the provision of digital infrastructure across the country, because the majority of Indonesia area has been connected by internet, as you and implementing what we call the e-government and One Data Indonesia. I believe that you familiar with One Data Indonesia. One Data Indonesia is about the data governance, how to strengthen data governance flowing from many local governments and also line ministries. So it's very important to make sure that we have a strong data governance. And as we witness today, participants of these webinars coming from across the country, of course, and also international speakers, and also it clearly indicates that the internet connectivity in Indonesia is getting better and much better. So we are more connected than ever. So I think it's important to mention that. I also reminded by a moderator, because the participants of this webinar, majority is Indonesian. So I will switch my language from English to Bahasa. So I believe that I think it's also a good opportunity for the ambassador and also Mr. Collie Brown to learn Bahasa more effectively now. So I will switch my Bahasa, my language to Bahasa Indonesia. Is it okay, Excellency?
It's okay, and we have very capable translators on as well.
Okay,
So
okay.
we're good.
Yeah.
I will practice.
Okay, that's good. Excellent. It's good practice. So I will start. Oh yeah, saya akan mulai dengan.
So I will start my presentation first with a very important question of why Public Procurement Reform Agenda is important.
That's the first question. Itu adalah pertanyaan pertamanya.
So that's my first question. Why is this an important agenda? And now I'm going to share my presentation. I hope the host has allowed me share screen feature.
Okay. So you can see my slide on the screen.
Hopefully you can see my slide now on the screen.
So sudah kelihatan ya? Sudah. Oh, okay. I will share with you the information on the public procurement profile. Untuk memberikan konteks dan juga pemahaman.
And this presentation aims to give you an overview as well as the answer or the justification of why this afternoon's topic is highly strategic, highly relevant, and very important for the national development. As we have heard from the opening remarks earlier, the impact of corruption to development is tremendous. And so the commitment of the Indonesian government to tackle corruption is very strong, and we are fully committed to support all efforts to that purpose. So hopefully our panelist, Ms. Sarah Sadika, I believe will also talk about corruption in public procurement. This is the profile of public procurement in 2020. We can see starting from the bottom row. The budget of ministries and public institutions as well as local government amount to around 2,148.2 trillion rupiah. I repeat, 2,148.2 trillion rupiah. And from that number, we break down into spending through public procurement. And procurement spending accounts for around 1,027.1 trillion rupiah. And if we are to use the in USD, it's going to be an equivalent of around more than 73 billion US dollars. So of the 2,000.1 trillion rupiah, these can be broken down further to procurement plan of for 853.8 trillion rupiah. And this amount equals to around more than 60 billion US dollars. And then we have around 316.9 trillion rupiah in e-procurement. This just gives us an illustration of how huge the public procurement activities are. So the spending is significant, both procurement done by line ministries and public institutions, as well as local government. And this is a very important context to start with. In 2020, the reason why we have so much spending for procurement, and if we look at the trend, we are going to see an increasing numbers from year to year. And this is in line with the increasing state budget. So our state budget, or APBN, for 2020, for 2020 spending is 2,739 trillion, or equal to around 195 billion US dollars. 195 billion US dollars.
Yeah, in 2020. Next year, tahun depan, anggaran itu meningkat lagi menjadi
next year, the budget is going to be increased to 2,750 trillion rupiah, or equal to around 196 billion US dollars. This means that amid such challenging situation today, the government spending is still increasing from year to year. The reason for that is because the government's role, especially during this time of pandemic, has become even more vital to maintain the economy and also to sustain the livelihoods and social lives of our people. Government expenditure is a very important intervention that we can take during this time, and so the government has taken a very difficult decision that has never happened before, and that is to increase our budget deficit. So this is a very important starting point in this very difficult fiscal time for our fiscal condition. We want to make sure that our economy can still move and social assistance can also continue despite the situation. And even though we have to decide to increase our deficit. This is part of a government's strong commitment to make sure that our development can continue. And so efforts to strengthen reform in public procurement has become not just important, but vital. This is what I want to emphasize, and this answers my first question of why public procurement reform agenda is such an important topic, a very strategic, very relevant theme for discussion. The second reason, I think we can see from recent incidents in our corruption case, the majority of corruption cases are associated with public procurement. And that is why we need to strengthen public procurement reform. We need to make sure that we can maintain the momentum and make it stronger from time to time. I also would like to mention that under the coordination of the National Public Procurement Agency, or LKPP, we have experienced a very important transformation in our public procurement system in the past 10 years. I would like to share with you in this opportune moment that based on in the 2019 study, our unit was tasked to work with the IMF and to conduct a study on public investment management assessment, or PIMA. Based on that study, it's shown that our national public procurement system has achieved important achievements. For example, 75% of 70% of the procurement is competitive and using the electronic procurement system.
Procurement system. Dan yang kedua, informasi-informasi yang
And secondly, information regarding public procurement is now being updated regularly by LKPP. These are some of the important achievements that need to be recognized in our public procurement transformation in the past 1 decade. In addition to that, well, despite the achievements, we realized that there remain important challenges going forward. For example, institutional arrangement and then regulatory framework, the institutional capacity, both individual staff members as well as the capacity of the institution, both at the central level and at the local government level. And lastly is infrastructure. So to make sure that public procurement can be carried out smoothly. I think if we look at the public procurement profile and all,
it is clear here about the involvement of micro, small, and medium enterprises in our public procurement system. This is actually a very important achievement during the pandemic because they are among the most affected by the pandemic. So by improving the system, small and medium enterprises in our, so this entire slide can tell you many stories. First, about the important who are involved in our public procurement service, which includes small and medium enterprises, micro, small, and medium enterprises. This is among the most important achievement that we have achieved so far. What about the strategies to strengthen our public procurement system? In our medium-term development plan 2020-2024, the positioning of public procurement reform is clear. It is included in the first and seventh national development agendas. Those are the place or the position of our public procurement reform in the framework of anti-corruption measures as well as the public procurement reform. So the government has strong commitment to strengthen and improve our public procurement system. So this is the detail because each agenda will in turn derived into priority programs, projects, and activities. So this is to showcase the linkages between strategies and how all will help to achieve the first national development agenda and also the seventh national development agenda. Public procurement is also an important element of the good governance improvement and also the rule of law improvement. So this is where the National Procurement Agency plays important role in bureaucratic governance reform. So basically, it is clear that the government want to reform our public procurement service. These are the activities conducted by the National Procurement Agency in 2021. First, they strengthened the local or sectoral catalog contracts. They develop e-catalog so that we can have more stakeholders involved, including MSMEs. We also want to improve the maturity of the procurement units across Indonesia. We also want to centralize our SPSE. And later, maybe this will be explained by Ibu Sarah from LKPP. So we're not only talking about the institutional and regulatory framework, but we also want to strengthen the necessary infrastructure to deliver various reform and improvement of our public procurement system. So this is the presidential regulation on national corruption prevention strategy. This will be explained further by Pak Hydrali. He will explain about the national corruption prevention strategies with three main focuses, including the first one is licensing, the second is state finances, and the third one is law enforcement. And we will see where is the position of public procurement, which is under focus 2, action 7, with clear and detailed explanation about all of the components, including by improving professionalism and modernizing our public procurement. That's action 7 in our national corruption prevention strategy. So hopefully this will give us some idea that in our national corruption prevention strategy, we already have clear strategy to reform our public procurement system. These are some priority programs for bureaucracy reform and governance. So what about public procurement? It is actually under the third pillar, institutional arrangement and business processes. You can see there's LKPP here, and also under pillar 4, performance accountability system reform. LKPP also plays very important role in bureaucracy reform and governance agenda. Now, I would like to invite you to review this about the government initiative on electronic-based government system, which is also known by e-government, from the planning, budgeting, procurement, monitoring and evaluation, and payment. This is actually integral parts of our electronic-based government system or e-government. E-procurement is also an integral part of this e-government system. This is very important for me to share with you because it shows that from the planning phase, the agenda of public procurement will be strengthened. And to ensure that this can runs well, this system will be supported by other existing systems, including Indonesia data governance system, as I mentioned earlier, One Data Indonesia. This is an example on the action plan on national corruption prevention strategy, especially to strengthen and modernize the procurement of goods and service. So basically increasing professionalism and modernizing. So Excellency Ambassador, if we were to have cooperation, maybe we can focus on efforts to increase the professionalism and modernizing the procurement, the public procurement. So this is very important with clear success criteria. Therefore, we warmly welcome any offer to cooperate with Indonesia, with Anti-Corruption Commission, and also with the National Public Procurement Agency, especially to improve the professionalism and modernizing the public procurement system. These are the four pillars of government procurement reform, which we are discussing today, starting from the regulatory framework, the institutional framework, and also procurement operation and market practice. And last one is integrity and transparency. How much more time do I have? 5 more minutes. Okay, perfect. So I'll go to the closing part soon. So this is the closing. Uh, and hopefully I will be right on time. So what I would like to emphasize here is first about the commitment of the Indonesian government to eradicate and prevent corruption is very clear as outlined in the medium-term development plan 2020-2024 and also in our presidential regulation on national corruption prevention strategy. So we need to promote this, all of the stakeholders, the national level stakeholders, the local stakeholders, so that we can monitor the implementation of this national corruption prevention strategy. So let's work together to ensure the successful implementation of this government policy. And the second one is public procurement reform, which is an integral part of our bureaucracy and governance reform. Therefore, this is very important. We need to ensure the success of bureaucracy and governance reform, which is an important prerequisite to ensure that we can reform our public procurement system as expected. So we would like to emphasize on how public procurement reform is actually part of the bureaucracy reform and governance reform. Next couple of years, the government will keep on promoting digital transformation, which play very strategic role, an important role to accelerate public procurement agenda in Indonesia. Because digital transformation should not only be seen from the should not only about providing the infrastructure, but also to make sure that the infrastructures are used. One of the most important users are or is public procurement, and public procurement is done from the national level to local level. That's why digital transformation is one of the most important prerequisite, most important intervention to accelerate the public procurement agenda. And lastly, is strong collaboration among national government agencies, national and subnational government, and between public and private sector, which will be the key to the success of the public procurement reform agenda. That's all that I can share with you in 20 minutes time allocated by the organizing committee to me. Hopefully, this give you some idea, and later I hope the panelists can further discuss about these issues in detail. Thank you and greetings. Thank you, Pak Taufik, for explaining about the strategic path planned by the government of Indonesia in public procurement reform. Uh, this is actually a very important piece of information for us. So let's go directly to the panel discussion. Welcome, Mr. Haidral Ali, and welcome Ibu Sarah Sadika. Maybe for the first opportunity, I would like to welcome Pak Hai, and then for the second opportunity, Ibu Sarah. So Pak Hai, maybe you can explain about the progress of the national strategy, especially in relation to public procurement. Thank you. Good afternoon. Greetings, Excellency Ambassador Owen Jenkins, distinguished Pak Taufik Hanafi. Good afternoon, sir. Ibu Sarah Sadika, uh, who is my frequent discussion partner, all of the panelists and participants of this webinar. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me to speak in this webinar. I have a presentation. Maybe the operator can help me to show, to share my PowerPoint. I think this theme is actually very familiar for the public procurement practitioners in Indonesia. But as Pak Taufik said earlier, and maybe later Ibu Sarah will confirm this, there are public procurement reform agenda in Indonesia. Currently, our public procurement system has or is already much better. We already have the national and subnational catalog sector. We have also built the capacities of the procurement specialists in different government agencies, but still there is a big question, even after all of these reform initiatives. Why the corruption rate remain high? This is also a question mark for us. I tried to make a simple calculation, as Pak Taufik said earlier, in 2020, the size of our national budget is 2,400 trillion. A couple of years ago, it was only 475 trillion. So it grows exponentially. And for public procurement, it is actually more than 45% of our national budget. As Pak Taufik said earlier, for 2020 national budget, we have 1,163 trillion for public procurement. This was actually stated by the president in the national coordination meeting of LKPP. 423 trillion is for infrastructure, 508 trillion for education sector, and 132 trillion for healthcare sector. And for out of this public procurement budget, we will have more than 1 million packages. So I think in Southeast Asia, our budget is the biggest among Southeast Asian countries. And we have 600, which will be procured by 632 procurement units. And we will have 700,000 suppliers. So in terms of budget and in terms of the goods and service procured, the size of our public procurement sector in Indonesia is very big. And if we see this data, around 70% of cases prosecuted, investigated and prosecuted by the KPK, Anti-Corruption Commission, involves public procurement. 65% involves bribery, 610 cases, and 21% is public procurement. And this is based on the Anti-Corruption Commission data 2004-2019. So bribery here also involves bribery in public procurement. So bribery or promises or abuse of power is very rampant in our public procurement. Next. Here we can see those who involved in corruption and crimes. Most of them are from private sectors, and second most is from parliament. So later we will see what are the correlations between private sector and parliament. And we also have government officials, national and sub-national level, and we cannot deny we also have the providers, goods and service providers involved in corruption crimes.
Kami coba carikan bahwa
And we also have data here that from Indonesia Procurement Watch, and they conducted a survey on 720 marketing managers or procurement managers in Indonesia, in companies operating in Indonesia, including state-owned enterprises. And when asked about the tender process, 93% of them reported that they had to bribe someone in order to get the award. 83% reported that it's impossible to win the project without committing bribery. In a KPK study, 82% of the running officials in elections has sponsors behind them. It can be enterprises or companies, or they have what they call as their supporting teams, their success teams. And then the coordinating minister for politics and human rights, Mahfud MD, mentioned that 92% in elections are sponsored by the funders. So these are enormous pressure that we are going to face in our reform agenda, because the political intervention is very prominent. In this next slide, the data here I quote from Marepus Corner. 55% of our parliamentarians in the national parliament, they are business owners. So out of 560 members of the parliament, 318 of them are business owners. So 5 to 6 people of every 10 parliamentarians are business owners. And this is their position and their status in the company. Next. And this is also still about the role of the business owners and their share in our national parliament. And the next slide.
Bahwa di dalam beberapa kajian yang dilakukan,
based on number of studies,
masih ada problem pengadaan barang dan
there
jasa di Indonesia
remain significant challenges in our national procurement system that have not been addressed, but have become urgent issues here. First of all, we, as of now, still don't have a procurement law.
Bahkan usulan undang-undang pengadaan barang dan jasa ini adalah mandatory dari UNCAC.
And we have the UNCAC also highlight that we do not have a complaint mechanism in public procurement.
Kemudian masalah lain adalah terlalu banyak intervensi dan pengaruh internal maupun eksternal.
And another challenge is too much intervention, internal and external influences in public procurement. And third, the procurement organization is not structural, it's not self-sufficient, and we also do not have sufficient internal control. There's also a problem of the competencies of public procurement officers that are considered poor, as well as poor integrity of procurement officers and the lengthy process and procedures in public procurement. So going back to the key reform and corruption prevention, if we say that this is such a strategic issue, then we need a law on public procurement. And the law is to harmonize, to align with other relevant regulations. So, for example, perhaps we can have a law on construction services. When the NPPA or the LKPP issues a regulation that may conflict with the construction law, but if we have law, then then the law can take precedent over the LKPP regulation. So we needed to provide legal certainty. If we are serious in preventing corruption and to prevent abuse of authority, abuse of office, we need to start drafting the law. In comparison, Timor-Leste, whose budget is only 3 trillion and just only 1,200,000 population, they have the public procurement law. And South Africa, for example, they also have procurement in their constitution translated into public procurement law.
Kalau kita lihat di Asia Tenggara ini, hanya Indonesia dan Myanmar yang belum punya undang-undang pengadaan barang dan jasa.
In ASEAN, only Indonesia and Myanmar that are missing the public procurement law. This should be our agenda to reform as part of our public procurement reform, providing legal certainty and also to strengthen the position and role of LKPP, and also to introduce the public mechanism complaint that we only have on paper right now. The next slide is, and this is very important as part of regulatory reform, and that is law on the burden of evidence. So in our efforts of corruption prevention, one of the legal instruments that we do need is the law on burden of proof. We know that public officials, their wealth is only increasing after they are in office. They can see their asset declaration or asset report, but it's very difficult for us to prove that because we do not have the necessary legal basis to prove that their wealth or their assets are legitimately acquired or illicitly acquired. So this is a very important strategic instrument to have. And this is also a concept that has been promoted since a long time by the civil society. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to
Ini tadi yang
make this a
oleh
priority.
Taufik ya,
And
dilakukan oleh Stranas bahwa
this is mentioned
tadi
by
disampaikan
Taufik
Prof.
earlier.
Tadi
This is
adalah
the strategy, national
program
strategy
pencegahan
on
korupsi
corruption
berdasarkan
prevention
perintah Presiden
pursuant to the
Presiden 54 tahun
presidential
2018
regulation
bahwa
54
kami
of 2018
di 2019-2020
that in
sedang mengerjakan
2019
beberapa program
2020
dan
we have completed number of things.
dari problem-problem yang di atas, maka Stranas menyusun strategi nasional pencegahan
Based
korupsi
on
sehingga
these
itulah
outputs we
program
have
yang
proposed, we
dilakukan
have
oleh
designed
Stranas saat ini
programs under the
dalam
national
rangka
strategy in
melaksanakan
collaboration with
ketertiban
Bappenas, with the
dan
Home Affairs
kedisiplinan
Ministry,
dan
Ministry
beberapa
of Bureaucratic
poin
Reform,
ini
as
menjadi
well as the other
trigger
ministries
ya
and
untuk kita
agencies.
memantisipasi
These are some
proses
of the
pengadaan barang yang
our way
transparan
forward to
dan
build a
transparan.
transparent and
Jadi
accountable
kalau kita
public
lihat
procurement
memang
system.
di dalam
So
program Stranas itu adalah
you can see
menggunakan
that as part of the national strategy, we have programs to improve the professionalism and to modernize public procurement system.
memberi dukungan dan mendorong
And we support, we encourage LKPP, we work together with LKPP to establish a public procurement unit that is going to be a permanent unit, independent and part of the organization structure.
unit kerja pengadaan barang dan
In the
jasa
past,
ini
public
belum permanen dan
procurement
belum
units, they
mandiri,
are ad hoc
sehingga
and they're
kalau
not
kita mau melakukan reformasi
independent.
pengadaan barang dan jasa, maka organisasi atau
But if we
unit
want to
kerja pengadaan
do
barang
a
dan
public
jasa ini
procurement reform,
adalah
then
hal
these
pertama yang harus
units,
kita
procurement units, should
perbaiki.
be the first thing that
Kemudian
we improve.
untuk unit kerja pengadaan barang dan jasa ini di dalam Stranas
And
dilakukan
in the national strategy, we are also taking various measures together with LKPP to improve and empower our procurement service units. And so now all ministries, public agencies at national and subnational level, they all have their dedicated public service units. These are independent units and part of their organization structure. The officers there are also have been made as functional officers. This is a collaboration between our team at the National Strategy Secretariat with LKPP, and we also conduct regular monitoring and evaluation activities. Also, together with LKPP, we encourage payment mechanism using an electronic system. So now that we have the e-catalog for public procurement, we believe that e-payment is the logical next step to improve our e-catalog system for our public procurement. We also encourage the improvement of our vendor management system, or CCAP, and currently CCAP can only be employed in a quick tender method, but we encourage LKPP that in the future we can use CCAP as our main vendor management system. And our expectation is that we can be more selective of vendors, so not all vendors can be eligible to bid in a public project, and only the best vendors, trustworthy vendors that can participate in a tender process. This is our effort to filter quote unquote efforts from parliamentarians who perhaps newly establish an enterprise to get into a public project. So we want to make sure that only eligible vendors that can participate in public or government projects. And as I have also mentioned, we encourage public procurement using e-catalog. So together with LKPP, we have we've been working with 5 ministries with the largest budget to develop their e-catalog, or what we call a sectoral e-catalog. And these ministries have followed up this proposition, and by July, these 5 ministries are now doing their procurement using e-catalog. We also have approached 34 provinces to also have their local e-catalog. So we encourage them to develop their local e-catalog in collaboration with LKPP. And finally, we also want to apply e-catalog in marketplace. So the LKPP's e-catalog can be used as some kind of marketplace for up to 75 million spending. And our last recent information from LKPP is that these direct purchase, the value can be increased to 200 million. I think it's going to be very useful, especially during this pandemic, to help start recovering the economy by giving greater access to MSMEs. We also realized that there are weaknesses in our monitoring system, and that's why we also identify bureaucracy reform in terms of the government's internal auditors. So fraud, abuse in our public procurement system, one of the contributing factor to that is the weak monitoring. That's why in our national strategy, we also identify the capacity building for our officers and strengthening their independency. And we also want to elevate their status as an official, so their echelon level can be improved. So we are taking these measures. Hopefully all of this can contribute to better monitoring activities. So in conclusion, we need to carry out legal framework reform, and this is an absolute must in order to support fundamental reform in public procurement. And secondly, we need to be able to regulate, to control, and to supervise the performance of vendors and suppliers using VMS. I think we have taken many steps to improve our public procurement system by establishing the more robust system and by establishing more robust mechanism. But what we need to address more is in terms of selecting potential vendors and suppliers. Third, we need to develop effective internal control mechanism by strengthening our internal auditors and building their capacity. Our target in 2020 is to achieve these targets based on the national strategy objectives. We want to be able to educate our internal auditors who are professional and competent. And fourth is to develop a complaint handling mechanism by an independent agency. This is also uh, has been a continued proposition that we've been talking about for quite a long time with LKPP, and we're hoping to be able to realize this. Finally, is to make sure that there's a fair competition and transparent system using VMS. Again, VMS is mentioned because we want to be able to select the best suppliers and vendors and who can uphold their contractual obligations when they engage with the government. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention. Peace be upon us all, and greetings.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Hai atas paparannya.
Thank you, Pak Hai, for that presentation.
Pak Hai memang diperlukan
you mentioned, for example, it's very important to have a public procurement law, to have a stronger regulatory framework. And this is also in line with the recommendation from UNCAC second cycle review of Indonesia. I would like to greet good afternoon, Ibu Sarah.
Selamat siang, Bu Putri.
Good afternoon, and I apologize that we're a little bit behind time. Hopefully, you are still willing to share with us about the progress of LKPP, and I know that you must have achieved so much progress in the past 2-3 years. So, Ibu, the forum is yours.
Terima kasih, Bu Putri. Yang saya hormati
Thank you,
Bapak
Putri.
Duta Besar,
Your
yang saya hormati
Excellency
Pak
Ambassador
Collie
of
Brown,
UK,
yang
distinguished
saya
Mr.
hormati
Collie
senior
Brown,
saya di Bappenas, Pak Taufik
distinguished
Hanafi,
Taufik Hanafi,
juga
my
sahabat
senior
saya
in
Pak Hayi,
Bappenas,
Bapak
and
Ibu
also
sekalian
my
peserta
dear colleague
webinar,
Pak
selamat
Hayi,
siang,
distinguished
salam
participants of the
sehat untuk
webinar,
kita
good
semua.
afternoon and greetings.
Pertama-tama kami menyampaikan terima kasih
I would like to,
untuk
first of
British
all,
Embassy, untuk
thank the British
UNODC,
Embassy,
juga untuk Pak Taufik,
also
Bappenas,
UNODC,
yang telah
and my
mengangkat
thanks also
isu
to
procurement
Bappenas
ke
for
permukaan. Karena
highlighting
memang tadi
public
kita lihat
procurement
juga
issue
dari
for
presentasi Pak
today's event.
Hayi,
I think
data
as
dari
we have
KPK
heard
menunjukkan
from Pak
bahwa
Hayi,
salah satu
KPK's
area
data
korupsi
show that
adalah
one of
melalui
the most
procurement
vulnerable
atau
sector
pengadaan barang
to
jasa
corruption
pemerintah.
is
Karena
public
itu akan
procurement.
sangat relevan kalau siang hari ini
And
kita
that is why
mendiskusikan hal
it is
tersebut,
only
terutama dalam
apt that we
rangka
are
Hari
discussing
Anti
public
Korupsi
procurement
yang akan
reform,
kita
especially with respect
Saya
to
ada presentasi Bu Putri yang
I
mungkin bisa
have
di-share
a presentation
untuk
that maybe
peserta.
can be shared with the
Di halaman
participants.
selanjutnya,
Next slide, please.
di halaman selanjutnya kami menyampaikan hal-hal yang akan kita diskusikan.
This is the
Pertama ada
outline
procurement
of my
profile. Nanti
presentation.
kita lihat kurang lebih
First
seperti
is the
data yang
procurement
disampaikan
profile,
oleh Pak Taufik,
which is
juga
actually
Pak
very
Hayi
similar to the
tadi.
data
Lalu
that
saya
has
akan
been shared
menyinggung
by
sedikit
Pak
sejarahnya
Taufik and Pak
procurement
Hayi.
reform. Kita mulai dari
I will
tahun
also discuss
sebenarnya
about
jauh
the
dari tahun
procurement
2008
reform
sebelum
history
LKPP berdiri,
or
bahkan
journey,
kita sudah mulai dengan
which
reform. Lalu sedikit akan
date
kami
back
singgung
from
procurement
2008,
reform
even
di
before
tahun ini,
LKPP was
tahun
established. And then
2020,
we
yang
will discuss about
sebenarnya
the
agenda
procurement
dari
reform
procurement
agenda
reform
2020.
itu kami ambil atau kami
Actually, the agenda
akomodir
of
dari
procurement reform is
4 pilar
taken
yang
from
ada
the
di
4
dalam
pillars
baseline indicator, suatu assessment tools yang dikeluarkan oleh
of
OECD.
the
Agenda
OECD
procurement
baseline
kita terdiri
assessment
dari
tools,
policy dan legal
which
framework. Nanti
is
saya hanya
policy and
menyentuh
legal framework.
isu integrity dan
I will only focus
transparansinya.
on the issue
Sebenarnya
of
ada satu
integrity and
agenda yang juga
transparency.
dibahas tadi oleh Pak Hayi
And there was
tentang
also one
institution dan
agenda that was
procurement
discussed
professionals.
by Pak
Tapi
Hayi about
dalam
institutions and
kesempatan
procurement
siang hari
professional.
ini, hal itu
But today,
tidak menjadi fokus. Kita akan
this
fokus
will not
banyak
be
di
a focus
hal
of
yang
my
ketiga,
presentation
yaitu operation
because
dengan
I opt to
marketnya,
focus more
terutama
on the
isu mengenai
operation and
electronic
market,
procurement
especially
system.
on the
Dan
electronic
yang
procurement
terakhir,
system.
sedikit mengenai
And
lesson
lastly,
learn yang
I will
kita
share
dapati
about
selama
the
melaksanakan
lesson learned
proses ini.
that we
Slide
have
selanjutnya,
gathered
Bapak Ibu, tadi
along
sudah
the way.
disampaikan oleh Pak
Next
Taufik
slide.
dan juga ada tadi data dari Pak Hayi juga. Saya kira kita bisa langsung ke slide yang
I think we can
berikutnya.
go to the next
Slide
slide
yang
now.
berikutnya sebenarnya ini data dari tahun kemarin.
This
Saya
is
belum
the
sempat ambil
data
lagi yang
from last
terakhir di
year.
tahun 2020.
I haven't
Tapi
received
yang
the
ingin
data for
kami
2020.
sampaikan, Bapak Ibu sekalian, kalau kita lihat yang 2019
But what I
saja
want
ya,
to share
Bapak
with
Ibu
you,
sekalian. Ini sayang, ini datanya kategori NIM, tapi maksudnya di yang atas yang 22
as you can see on the top
billion
part,
yang di sebelah sini,
22 billion,
22,11 billion itu adalah e-tendering.
22.11 billion.
Lalu
That's
yang
actually
ini
for
yang
e-tendering.
5 billion
And this
itu
one,
adalah
the 5
e-purchasing.
billion
Jadi
one,
ini adalah
that's actually
uang kita,
e-purchasing.
budget yang kemudian
So that's
dibelah,
our
dibagi-bagi berdasarkan
money, that's our
metodologinya.
budget.
Jadi tadi yang 22 billion adalah melalui sistem
Divided
e-tendering,
into
lalu
different
5,7 billion
category.
ini berdasarkan e-purchasing, lalu ini direct procurement,
This is for e-purchasing, this is for direct
12
procurement.
billion, Direct
12
appointment
billion.
sebenarnya sangat kecil.
Direct
Nah,
appointment is
ada
actually very
lagi
small.
namanya kalau bahasa kita tuh
And
swakelola atau biasa
we
disebut
also
juga
have
dengan
what we call
self-management atau
self-management
apa ya in-house procurement.
or
Ini
in-house
sebenarnya
procurement.
adalah bagian uang yang cukup besar.
This is
Dan
actually
sayangnya
quite a
memang
big
hingga
part.
hari ini kita belum mempunyai sistem yang
But
bisa
unfortunately,
tracking
we do
uang
not
yang
have any
dibelanjakan melalui
system
metodologi swakelola.
to track
Kecuali kalau
a budget
swakelolanya itu
spent
menggunakan pihak
using
ketiga atau
self-management,
menggunakan
unless
penyedia
if
barang
we
jasa
use
dan
a
melakukan
supplier,
prosesnya melalui
and
e-tendering atau
if
e-purchasing,
it is
maka
done
itu
through
bisa
e-tendering or
ditangkap atau
e-purchasing,
di-capture
then
angkanya.
we can
Tapi
capture
kalau
the
misalnya
numbers or the
Bappenas
data.
bekerja sama
But
dengan
if
UI
it's
ya,
only
dengan
Bappenas
universitas
working together
atau
with
kemudian
University of Indonesia
satu daerah
or
bekerja sama
one
dengan
local
suatu
government
ormas
working
gitu.
with
Itu datanya selama tidak
CSO
masuk ke dalam
CSO,
sistem,
as long
maka
as the
itu tidak
data is
bisa
not
kita tracking.
being
Itu
input
sangat
to
disayangkan
the
Bapak Ibu
system, we
sekalian
cannot track
karena
the data,
dengan melihat
which is
data
actually very
2019
unfortunate
saja,
because if
sebenarnya
we see
bagian
even
swakelola
in
atau in-house
2019,
ini itu cukup besar. Dan
this
kalau kita tidak tracking,
self-management or
maka kita
in-house
juga tidak
procurement
tahu
is
bagaimana
actually quite big. And
pelaksanaannya,
if we
apakah
do not
berjalan dengan baik,
track
compliance
this,
dengan
we don't
regulasi,
know
atau
whether
kemudian
or
ada
not they
satu
comply with
praktek-praktek yang tidak kita
regulation
inginkan.
or if there's
Pada
any
slide
Ibu
selanjutnya,
unwanted
iya.
practice.
Oke, terima kasih. Nah, di slide selanjutnya, Bapak Ibu, kami ingin menunjukkan besaran
On the next slide, we would
in-house
like
procurement
to
dari
show you
swakelola tadi. Nah, kalau kita
the
lihat,
size
memang
of
di
in-house
tahun
procurement.
pun hal ini menunjukkan bahwa swakelola kita itu
And
memang
as you can see,
besar.
it
Tapi
is
seperti yang
actually
tadi
very
kami
significant.
sampaikan, sangat disayangkan
But
sistem kita
unfortunately,
belum mampu
as I
untuk
said earlier,
men-tracking
our
bagaimana
system
proses itu dilakukan, terutama
is not
ketika
able
terkait dengan
to
swakelola
capture
yang dilakukan di pemerintah
the
daerah, di subnationals, dengan melibatkan
how this is done
jadi
unless
prosesnya
if
langsung
they
gitu ya, tidak melalui satu proses electronic procurement.
use electronic
Nah,
procurement
ini yang kemudian akan
system.
menjadi agenda terbesar LKPP, bagaimana
So this
kita
is the
akan
biggest
membangun sistem
agenda
yang
of
lebih lengkap
LKPP,
sehingga
how to
apa yang
build a more
dianggarkan, apa yang
comprehensive
diproses itu
system
akan bisa kelihatan secara transparan.
so that everything that
Pada
we are
slide
doing
selanjutnya,
can
Bapak Ibu
be more
sekalian, kalau tadi
transparent.
kita bicara procurement profile
In the
dan
next
mana yang
slide,
masih
next slide
bisa
please.
dikatakan bolong dan perlu kita tambal, perlu kita
So
perbaiki.
we discussed about
Maka
the
pada
procurement
slide
process and what
ini
need to be
menunjukkan bagaimana
improved.
kita
In
melakukan,
this slide,
bagaimana procurement itu menemui satu
I want
dinamika, bagaimana procurement itu kelihatan dari setiap tahunnya
to show you
kreativitas dan ide-ide inovasi di dalam procurement.
about the
Yang pertama
creativity
kalau kita
and
lihat di tahun
innovative
2000
idea.
sebenarnya kita baru pertama kali mengeluarkan
In
satu
the year of
Kepres,
2000,
pada saat itu namanya
we
Kepres
issued
tentang suatu procurement yang pada
a
saat itu
presidential
dikatakan perubahan yang besar dan juga
regulation on procurement,
kenapa salah satunya
which
yang kita
was actually
cantumkan dan kita
quite
atur di
important
dalam Kepres itu
because
adalah
in that
mengenai keterbukaan kompetisi.
presidential
Kalau
regulation,
dulu,
we
zaman dulu sekali, sebagai
regulate
contoh
about
mungkin
competition.
senior-senior yang
Maybe
sebelumnya
my
banyak pengalaman di
seniors
bidang pengadaan, mengalami proses pengadaan itu, misalnya kompetisinya hanya di antara Jakarta dengan
remember
orang
that
Jakarta.
the
Maka
competition
biasanya
used
orang
to
yang di
be
luar Jakarta, terutama yang jauh,
among
jangan pun
vendors in the
ikut
same
serta
region. For
dalam
instance, like
pengadaan,
people
tahu atau
or company that are
terinformasi
based in
bahwa
Jakarta,
Jakarta sedang ada
and
procurement, itu
while
mereka tidak
those
dapat.
who are
Nah,
outside
di
of
tahun
Jakarta
2000 kita
don't even
buka
get the information
informasinya
about
pertama kali
the
waktu itu dengan koran. Kalau Bapak Ibu sekalian pernah dengar, di zaman itu
bidding
ada salah
process.
satu koran
And
nasional yang oplahnya besar, yang
we
terbitnya
decided
sampai
to
jauh.
actually
Itu
make it mandatory
beberapa halaman itu
for
diisi
all
dengan
of the
istilahnya
bidding
tender-tender
of
pemerintah.
the government
Kesempatan
request
teman-teman
for bid
penyedia, pelaku
to be
usaha
advertised
Jakarta itu
in
mendapatkan
national newspapers
yang
so that
cukup update. Yang kedua
vendors
juga
from out of Jakarta can also
itu
get
adalah
updated information.
tentang strengthening procurement professional dan institutions. Karena
The second
pengalaman
one is about strengthening procurement
itu
professionals
para
and
pengelola
institutions.
pengadaan itu
Because
sebenarnya
at that
mereka
time,
tidak dilatih. Bahkan mereka dalam melaksanakan proses
the
pengadaan
procurement professionals
hanya ikut
were not
pada
well
seniornya
trained.
saja,
They only
tanpa dia
follow what
mendalami,
their
mengetahui mengenai
predecessor
aturan
did
pengadaan itu
without knowing for
sehingga
sure
tentu
about the
prosesnya
procurement
menjadi tidak
regulation.
terukur.
As a result,
Karena
the
itu di tahun
process
2000
is not
pertama kali
measurable.
kita
So
minta
in the
untuk
year
melakukan
2000,
pelatihan itu secara masif
we
nasional
decided to
dan
conduct
kemudian kita
massive training,
atur bahwa yang melakukan proses pengadaan hanya
and
orang-orang
we
yang sudah
decided that
lulus
only
dan
those
bersertifikat
who
pengadaan. Hal ini maksudnya adalah
have
untuk
passed the
memastikan
exam
bahwa
and
proses
received the
pengadaan
certification
sekurang-kurangnya dia
can
comply dengan
manage
aturan.
the
Karena pada
procurement
zaman dulu
process
kondisinya
to
sangat
ensure
jauh
that
dari
everyone
demikian
can
juga
comply to the
kita
regulation.
memperkenalkan electronic procurement. Nah,
We
itulah
also
sebenarnya yang paling fundamental,
introduce electronic procurement.
yang paling fundamental yang pernah kita lakukan, pemerintah Indonesia pernah lakukan.
So that's the most
Setelah
fundamental
tahun
changes
2000,
taken by the
kita
government of
melakukan
Indonesia. And after the
inovasi
year 2000,
improvement dari procurement reform
we
tahun
implemented
2000.
some
Contohnya di tahun
reform
2005 kita semakin
initiatives. For
menggalakkan
instance, in
procurement
2005,
penggunaan e-procurement system.
we
Kalau dulu kita
promote the
ngomongnya
use
cuma
of
announcement
e-procurement
saja,
system.
sekarang kita
In the
sudah
past, we only
melakukan
focused on
Lalu di tahun
announcement, but now
2005
we
kita sudah
started to do
melakukan
e-tendering.
national
And also in
certification dan
2005,
training untuk pengelola
we
pengadaan
conduct the
yang
national
akan melaksanakan
certification
proses
program
pengadaan.
for the
Lalu
procurement
kemudian di tahun
officers of
2007,
every government agency.
2008,
And in
e-procurement system
2007,
dibuat dan
2008,
kemudian
we
kita roll
strengthened the
out secara
e-procurement
nasional.
system and we rolled this out
Demikian juga
nationally.
di tahun 2007,
And also in
LKPP pun berdiri
2007,
karena
we
LKPP
established
merupakan
the
bagian
National
dari
Procurement
agenda
Agency
reformasi,
as part
yaitu
of
untuk
our
memastikan
reform
policy dan juga
initiatives
kebijakan serta
to
sistem yang
ensure that
dibangun
the
itu memang
policies
bertujuan
and regulations
pada saat itu untuk efisiensi, transparansi keuangan
can
negara,
achieve
aspek
state
birokrasi,
finances,
anti korupsi dan
efficiency, can
Lalu kalau
contribute
kita lihat mulai
to
2010 keluar
anti-corruption measures.
regulasi-regulasi baru dengan ide-ide
And
baru.
starting from
Lalu
2007,
di
we
tahun
have new
2012
regulations and new
kita
ideas.
keluar dengan
And in
ide
2012,
e-katalog yang sampai saat
we
ini
had a new
ide
idea
tentang
of
e-katalog ini
e-catalog.
atau sistem
And up until
e-katalog ini
now, this e-catalog
makin besar dan biasanya menjadi
becomes
hot issues kalau kita bicara mengenai procurement pada saat
more or become bigger
Pada tahun
and become hot issues
2013 kita
whenever we talk about
memperkenalkan
e-procurement. And in
General Procurement
2013,
Planning. Kalau
we
teman-teman
introduced
pengadaan
general procurement planning,
sebut biasanya sirup. Sirup itu sistemnya, yaitu sistem informasi rencana umum
which is
pengadaan.
actually including
Dan yang
sirup,
terakhir di tahun
basically the general procurement
2018,
plan.
2019
In
hingga saat ini
2018,
kami masih
2019, and
terus
up until
bekerja
now,
untuk
we are
mengintegrasikan
still
seperti tadi yang
working
disampaikan
to
oleh Pak Taufik
integrate our
sebelumnya,
system
bahwa
as
data yang tersedia
shared
ataupun
by
proses yang
Pak
dilakukan oleh
Taufik earlier,
pengadaan itu sebenarnya lebih baik
that
lagi
the
kalau
data
bisa terintegrasi
will
dengan
be,
sistem-sistem
it
yang
will be
lain.
more ideal if we
Dan
can
yang
integrate our data
terakhir
and
di tahun
system.
2018 kita kembali
In
mengeluarkan
2018,
perpres yang
again,
baru
we
tentang pengadaan
issued
barang
a
jasa
new
yang sebenarnya
regulation
intinya
on
adalah untuk
procurement of goods and
menyederhanakan
services
proses. Karena
to
procurement
streamline the
diharapkan
process,
seperti tadi
because procurement
pendapat ataupun masukan dari Pak Hai bahwa lama prosesnya gitu. Nah, sekarang kita mencoba untuk banyak
the procurement process was
melakukan
deemed
proses
to
yang
be
lebih sederhana tanpa
very
mengurangi
cumbersome and lengthy,
akuntabilitasnya.
but now
Nanti di
so
ujung
now we
dari
want to
presentasi
simplify the
ini
process
sebenarnya
without
lesson learn-nya adalah tidak
decreasing the
lain dari
accountability.
data. Karena untuk
So at the
mempercepat
end, I
satu proses
will share with
pengadaan
you that
sebenarnya kita
the
tidak bisa hanya memotong
biggest lesson learned
rantainya.
is
Tapi
data,
yang bisa kita
because
lakukan
to
sebenarnya
streamline the
adalah
process,
ketika
we cannot
rantai itu
cut
sudah
the chain.
dikerjakan oleh kementerian
But
lain
what we can do
atau
is,
datanya sudah
if
tersedia
it
di
has been
nasional
done
dan
by
itu
other
bisa kita
agencies,
ambil,
or
maka
if the
itu
data is
otomatis
available
akan
at the
mempercepat
national level,
proses pengadaan.
we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So
Eh,
automatically, it
Pada
will
slide
streamline
selanjutnya,
the
Bapak Ibu
process.
sekalian, kami
On the next
ingin
slide,
menyampaikan
I
mengenai
would like to share
isi
about
dari
the
Perpres
content
16
of
tahun
this
2018
presidential
tentang
regulation
pengadaan barang
number
jasa
16
yang
on
khususnya
2018 on
terkait
government
dengan
procurement,
subjek integriti dan
especially
transparansi.
the ones
Jadi kalau
that
kita
are related
lihat
to integrity
sekilas,
and transparency.
kita bisa menemukan hal-hal yang
As you can see here,
mewajibkan pimpinan, baik itu
there's an
menteri, kepala
obligation
daerah, kepala
of the
lembaga,
leadership, including
selalu
the
menjaga integriti dan transparansi dan
ministers
bagaimana melakukannya
or the head
adalah
of
di
regions
pasal-pasal sebagai
to
berikut.
maintain their integrity
Pasal
and
5, pasal
transparency.
6, pasal
In Article
7 itu
5, 6, and
adalah
7,
rumusnya,
we
prinsip-prinsipnya,
discussed
etikanya
about the
pengadaan, itu sudah
purpose, the
pasti.
principles, and the
Nah,
ethics
di
of
pasal
procurement
76 itu
in
kita bisa
Article
menemukan
76.
internal monitoring dan kontrol. Jadi ada
We have a
satu
discussion
mandatori,
about
ada
internal
satu
monitoring and
kewajiban
control.
bahwa itu
So
harus dilakukan. Internal
there's an
monitoring dan
obligation
evaluasi dalam proses
to
pengadaan
conduct
itu
internal
harus
monitoring
dilakukan
and
melalui
control in
internal
the
control
procurement
apparatus
process
atau
through
kalau
internal
bahasa kita
control
APID.
apparatus.
Lalu monitoring itu bisa dilakukan dengan berbagai cara.
And
Salah
monitoring can
satunya
also be
bisa
done
melalui audit, juga bisa
through audit
melalui review.
or through
Dan
review.
yang dimonitor itu harus dari
And the
awal, dari planning sampai
monitoring
nanti
should be done from the
bagaimana dan
planning
scope
phase
dari internal monitoring
until
ini
the
pun diatur
handover
di dalam
phase.
Perpres 16
And the scope
pasal
of the
76.
monitoring is
Lalu terkait
also
dengan
being
public
discussed in
complaint,
Article
Bapak Ibu sekalian,
76. With
itu
regards to
sebenarnya
public
ada
complaint,
diatur di dalam pasal 77, di mana kita sudah
it can be
memperkenalkan
seen in
whistleblowing
Article
system.
77,
Sistem ini bahkan sudah ada
where we
beberapa
introduced the
waktu sebelum
whistleblowing
lahirnya
system,
Perpres 16
which
ini. Jadi
actually precede
sistemnya sudah tersedia.
the government
Lalu yang
or this
kedua,
presidential regulation.
publik siapapun
And
masyarakat
in
itu
this case,
bisa
public
menyampaikan
can
komplainnya
submit
kepada
their
APID.
complaints to
Nah,
the
yang
internal
tadi disampaikan oleh
control
Pak Hayi tentang
apparatus
mekanisme
or
komplain,
internal
memang yang
supervisory apparatus.
diharapkan
And
adalah
as Pak Ai
komplain
said
itu
earlier,
diberikan kepada
it is expected that the
unit
complaint
atau lembaga atau apapun namanya yang independen. Karena
is
sekarang komplain itu diberikan
submitted
kepada
to independent
kementerian
agency
yang
and
memang
not
sedang
to
melakukan proses pengadaan itu. Jadi
the
contohnya kalau
ministry
Bappenas sedang punya
or
pekerjaan
agencies
proses
that
pengadaan konsultan, lalu
is
masyarakat
procuring the
komplain
service.
gitu atau
For
memberikan
instance, if the
masukan.
National Development
Nah,
Planning
maka masukan
Agency
itu diberikan kepada APID yang
is
ada di
running a
dan hal
procurement
ini dipandang memang
project,
belum mampu
then public should be able to submit
merefleksikan
their complaints not to Bappenas but
transparansi yang
to
sebenarnya.
other
Sehingga yang diusulkan
independent
yang
agencies to
sepemahaman
ensure
kami adalah
transparency.
adanya satu lembaga
So
yang
the
lebih
idea
independen.
is to have a
Nah,
more
terhadap
independent
ide
agency.
ini sendiri pun sedang kami bahas
We are
di
in the
internal
process of
LKPP,
discussing
bagaimana
this
kami harus
idea internally
menyikapinya karena kami juga
in LKPP
memahami secara
on how to
internasional
respond this,
praktik juga
because we also understand that the
yang
international
terakhir,
best practice
pasal
dictates that we need to
78
have
adalah
independent agency.
NOC atau
And then the last one is Article
Nah,
78,
pada
which
slide
discusses
selanjutnya Bapak
about
Ibu
sanction and
sekalian,
penalty.
kami akan menyampaikan mengenai
Next slide, I
arsitekturnya. Tadi
will
sekilas
explain
sudah
about the
disampaikan juga oleh
architecture,
Pak Taufik.
which was
Nah,
also
sebelum
explained
sampai
by
ke
Pak
sini
Nofri.
Bapak Ibu
But
sekalian,
before
karena
I
tadi
discuss about
baik Pak
the
Collie Brown, Pak Taufik
infrastructure,
menyinggung dan juga Pak Hayi
since Pak
menyinggung
Collie
sedikit
Brown and
mengenai
Pak
pandemi,
Hayi mentioned
bagaimana
about
procurement
the
itu
pandemic,
menyikapi
on
pandemi,
how
memang
we
beberapa
in
waktu setelah
procurement
terjadinya pandemi, maka di sekitar
should
bulan
also
April, Mei, kalau nggak salah,
work
kami pun sudah
around this
mengeluarkan
pandemic.
satu surat
In
edaran
April
baru
or May,
untuk
we
melakukan
issued a
proses-proses
circular
pengadaan dalam
on
kerangka pandemi. Jadi,
the
misalnya Bapak Ibu
procurement
sekalian,
guidelines
kalau dulu verifikasi
amid the
ya
pandemic.
melalui sistem itu
In
ada
the
beberapa
past,
tahap,
we
maka
have
sekarang
several
kita coba
phases
untuk
of
kita
verification or several stages of
Demikian
verification.
juga
Now
dengan kita terbitkan
we try
surat
to
edaran
streamline
Kepala
it.
LKPP nomor
And we also
3
issued a
yang
circular letter
mengizinkan
number
proses-proses
3,
yang lebih cepat
which
dan lebih
allow
sederhana
faster and
untuk
simplified
proses pengadaan
process
dalam rangka
for
pandemi,
procurement
dalam
of
rangka
pandemic
COVID.
response
Selain
or
itu,
COVID-19
kita
response.
juga mencoba
And
untuk
we
merespon
also
pandemi dari sisi pemulihan ekonomi
tried
nasional, yaitu
to
dengan semakin mendorong
consider
dan
about the national
memberdayakan
economic
UMKM
recovery
juga produk-produk
by
industri.
empowering the
Hal ini bisa
micro,
kita
small, and
lihat
medium
dari
enterprises
beberapa
and their
intervensi
products.
yang dilakukan oleh LKPP.
This can be seen from the
Misalnya tadi sudah
intervention
sempat
of
disebutkan
LKPP,
makin
including
mempercepat
as
atau
the one mentioned by the
membuat
previous
lebih
speaker
banyak e-katalog lokal.
on
Karena sebenarnya
local
e-katalog
e-catalog
lokal
initiatives,
itu lebih
because
dekat dengan
basically
UMKM
local
dan produksi
e-catalog
lokal. Karena sifatnya, skopnya,
can
ruang
better
lingkupnya
accommodate
memang
and
masih
empower
bersifat lokal, sehingga
MSMEs
UMKM ataupun
whose
industri
business are more
lokal
local
setempat
in nature.
tentunya akan lebih bisa
So the
melayani
local
kebutuhan dari
industries
yang
and
lokal. Dan
enterprises
ketika nanti mereka
can
semakin besar,
fulfill the local
kapasitas lebih
government
besar
needs.
lagi,
And
maka mereka
later,
bisa
when they
kemudian
grow bigger
ditingkatkan dan
and
masuk ke
stronger,
dalam yang nasional.
these MSMEs
Demikian juga
can
yang tadi disampaikan
graduate
terkait dengan
to
UMKM,
national
kami pun
e-catalog.
sudah mengeluarkan
Another thing about
satu
the
sistem baru,
MSMEs,
sistem
we
elektronik
are
yang
also
disebut dengan
launching a
Bela
new system
Pengadaan.
called Bela
Karena
Pengadaan.
sistem ini adalah
This is
memberikan kemudahan
a
bagi
system
dan juga peluang bagi
facilitates
UMKM untuk
and also
dapat
provide
melayani
opportunity for MSMEs
pemerintah. Contohnya,
to supply to
kalau
the government.
biasanya rapat perlu
For
jamuan,
instance,
makan, dan selama ini mungkin
for the
beliaunya
catering service
ke
of government
tempat-tempat makan yang
institutions.
franchise gitu. Sekarang kita bisa menggunakan budget kita
It
belanja
can be
langsung dari
maybe in the
semua
past
UMKM yang
the
terdaftar
food
atau masuk di dalam.
was procured from
Jadi itu kira-kira
big
tambahannya
chain,
yang terkait
but
dengan
now
pandemi,
it can
Bapak Ibu
be
sekalian.
procured
Karena tadi
from
sempat diangkat
MSMEs.
isunya. Yang akan kita sambung kemudian kita akan bicara mengenai
Now I would
arsitektur
like to
dari
discuss
integrasi
about
sistemnya.
the
Jadi
architecture
di
of the
awal
system
sudah
integration.
disampaikan oleh Pak
In
Taufik
the
dalam
beginning,
keynote-nya
Pak
bahwa
Taufik in
memang
his keynote
seharusnya
have
data dan
discussed
informasi itu bisa kemudian
that
saling
data
terintegrasi
and
sehingga bisa
information should
memberikan
be integrated
makna
so
dan
that
juga bisa memberikan
it can be more
benefit
meaningful and it can be more
pihak yang lebih banyak lagi.
beneficial
Jadi kalau
for
kita lihat
more
kotak yang di tengah-tengah
stakeholders.
yang disebut dengan kotak pengadaan,
If you can see here in the middle, the procurement box,
perencanaan.
procurement actually
itu
started
masuk ke dalam
with
sistem yang kita
planning,
sebut dengan SIRUP, sistem
and then
informasi
this
rencana
planning will
keuangan
then
perencanaan.
be inputted
Lalu
into our
kemudian
system
kita
called
masuk
SIRUP,
di sistem yang
the
implementasi.
procurement
Baik,
planning
Bu Putri,
system,
sebentar lagi.
and then after that the implementation
Saat ini
of
yang sudah
procurement.
cukup lama dan cukup mature, sudah cukup dewasa, itu adalah
Currently,
dan
the more
kemudian
mature one is
tapi
the
kalau Bapak Ibu
e-tendering.
sekalian tadi perhatikan bahwa yang
But
swakelola
if
bagaimana,
you
padahal
see,
di situ ada uang yang cukup besar.
I mentioned earlier
Hari
about
ini
the
kita
in-house
sedang
procurement.
membangun sistem yang kita
So what
sebut,
about the in-house
belum
procurement?
sebutkan namanya, belum punya namanya, tapi kurang lebih skopnya adalah untuk yang non-tendering
So basically,
purchasing. Demikian juga semua data informasi itu akan
all of
masuk
the
ke dalam
data
satu kontrak disebut dengan manajemen kontrak. Selanjutnya Bapak Ibu sekalian, kita akan bicara setelah kita mengembangkan sistem seperti ini. Di slide berikutnya, saya ingin sedikit memaparkan mengenai challenges-nya. Secara umum kita temukan ada 6 challenge sebenarnya di dalam pengembangan sistem, terutama sistem yang elektronik. Tapi yang ingin saya pastikan bahwa yang akan menjadi fokus kita itu adalah attitude. Jadi sebenarnya challenge terbesar kalau kita membangun sistem ataupun juga menyampaikan hal-hal yang baru terkait dengan procurement khususnya, yang paling besar pengaruhnya itu adalah attitude. Nah, pada slide
first important thing that we need to
saya
address
ingin
is
sedikit
attitude.
menyampaikan
In my
kenapa
next slide,
attitude yang
I would
kemudian
like
menjadi
to explain
permasalahan.
to you
Bukan
why
mengenai
we want to focus
people-nya,
on
bukan
attitude
mengenai
instead of
infrastrukturnya, tapi mengenai
people,
attitude. Sekarang
infrastructure.
kita bisa lihat contohnya di e-tendering, di SPSE. Kalau kita lihat apa namanya ya, karakteristik atau kelakuan dari teman-teman pengelola pengadaan yang akan memproses atau yang biasa memproses melalui sistem ini, mereka itu justru punya masalah bukan pada sistem. Tapi kalau kita sebut desain mereka melakukan korupsi atau rencana melakukan korupsi, itu sudah mereka mulai dari desainnya, dari perencanaannya, dari tornya, dari spesifikasinya. Itu yang kemudian membatasi persaingan. Nah, jadi di sistemnya itu ya otomatis dia akan memproses sesuai dengan apa isi dari tor dan seterusnya. Jadi ini attitude dari kita pengelola pengadaan. Kedua, kelihatannya inosen, tapi ini ternyata banyak menimbulkan apa namanya masalah-masalah di IT, di e-procurement. Misalnya share password. Ini sesuatu yang kalau orang kita mungkin biasa-biasa aja karena takut lupa passwordnya ditempel di atas komputernya. Tapi kemudian pihak-pihak yang memang mempunyai maksud-maksud tertentu itu bisa dengan mudah yang inosen begini ternyata kemudian menjadi masalah. Lalu attitude yang berikutnya bandwidth. Ini saya rasa Bapak Ibu sekalian sudah tahu cerita tentang bandwidth ini. Dan di LKPP sendiri kami di lantai 5 itu ada satu sistem, ada satu dashboard yang bisa memperlihatkan ketika satu daerah itu mulai memainkan bandwidth-nya. Sehingga kita bisa langsung melakukan dan juga dengan e-katalog kalau kita lihat permasalahannya itu adalah pada data. Kita tidak punya government spending analysis sehingga selalu kita tidak tahu apa yang kita butuhkan, padahal dari tahun ke tahun kita selalu membeli tentang hal itu. Lalu kita juga selalu tidak punya data mengenai market, mengenai supplier kita, mengenai price-nya, spesifikasinya, terutama kalau kita bicara mengenai barang-barang yang besar, seperti misalnya alat kesehatan, itu sangat-sangat terbatas. Sehingga kalau orang-orang pengadaan harus melakukan satu proses, kita tidak punya data apa-apa dari situ dan sangat tergantung dari supplier-supplier informasi yang diberikan oleh supplier. Bapak Ibu sekalian, karena waktunya tidak cukup banyak, sudah habis, saya hanya selintas saja pada slide ini. Sebenarnya saya ingin mendalami, memberi informasi lebih jauh mengenai elektronik katalog dan titik-titik terjadinya korupsi, tapi saya kira nanti bisa melalui diskusi saja. Dan yang terakhir mengenai lesson learned, ini adalah lesson learned yang kita dapatkan selama ini ketika kita membangun sistem, dan yang paling penting dari semuanya itu adalah memang 3 hal di atas. Satu, political support dari pemerintah itu sangat-sangat penting. Kita tadi sudah lihat bagaimana supportnya Bappenas, pemerintah terhadap anti korupsi dan juga kepada pengadaan. Lalu kita harus mulai menggunakan data yang bersama, data yang integrasi bersama. Kalau tidak, maka kita akan informasinya akan selalu terputus-putus. Dan dari sisi procurement, kita membutuhkan satu strategi namanya government purchasing. Mungkin itu dulu yang dapat kami sampaikan, Bapak Ibu sekalian. Terima kasih.
This is all. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Ibu Sarah. I think the last slide is, the 2 last slides are very important and interesting to talk about, but as a moderator, I need to give a fair time to all of our speakers. But thank you so much, Ibu Sarah. I think we can continue the discussion on the later on in this webinar. So I will now proceed to the second discussion session. I apologize if I seem to be rushing our webinar. And I would like to ask to our panelists and participants to extend our webinar. I know the schedule is to conclude by 5 p.m., but I would like to ask us to conclude or to extend by 20 minutes. So for the second panel session, I would like to call Mr. Warren Smith from the UK Government Digital Services.
I know you have a very short time because you have to join to another meeting, but I hope you can share your thought about the and what you could contribute to the reform agenda in procurement system in Indonesia. So time and screen is yours, Mr. Warren.
Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to present any slides, but I'll just talk through some material that I've shared previously with colleagues. So thank you very much, everybody. It's a great chance to be here to present the work that we're doing, and hello again to friends and colleagues that we've been working with so far in Indonesia. So yeah, my name is Warren Smith. I'm from the UK's Government Digital Service. And I'm the director of the Global Digital Marketplace Programme. And I was really touched and inspired by some of the comments that we've heard already today around the importance of digital transformation as a way of tackling corruption. And so often I describe this as digital government being the antidote to corruption in public procurement, because I think it really goes to the heart of what public sector reform means in terms of meeting the needs of citizens and businesses and increasing transparency and integrity. So what do we mean by that? Well, so in terms of internet era approaches to public procurement, it's really a focus on innovative, adaptive, and above all, as I've said, digital government approaches to address corruption in public procurement. And really what we're focusing on here is working with national and local governments to improve systems that govern public spending, systems that improve scrutiny through better quality, open data, and also building institutional capacity and capability to ensure sustainable change, which we've also heard about today. So really, this means applying the culture of the internet era, which supports collaborative, consensus-based, evidence-based decision-making based on user research. And this also means building coalitions and advocacy networks, working in the open, able to experiment, willing to experiment, but also focused on the problems to solve and the outcomes that achieve a social purpose, meeting the needs of communities across civil society. It also means applying the working practices and processes of the internet era, which is really about standards-based and outcomes-based approaches that tackle problems incrementally and iteratively, in other words, with short feedback loops. It also means investing in trusted, empowered, and multidisciplinary teams focused on meeting users' needs and using digital, open, and network systems and tools of governance. Business models of the internet era. These are approaches which embrace multi-supplier delivery, including social, charitable, and voluntary organizations, as well as co-designing and co-delivering with service users, collaborative commissioning across organizational boundaries, as well as other incentives such as payment by results. And in terms of the tools, techniques, and technologies of the internet era, we hear a lot of talk about the opportunity of machine learning, artificial intelligence, which are important things to be looking at, and also open source software, open data, big data analytics, but also knowing how and when best use new and emerging technologies as well. And really, ultimately, this is all about taking advantage of the digital technologies throughout the entire public spending life cycle, from planning through to procuring and contracting and through into implementation, and really to design out the opportunities for corruption, fraud, and bribery to manifest. And so we've been talking to many users so far around the world, initially in person, but very quickly had to adapt to virtual delivery. And that covers the Americas, North and South, Africa, Asia Pacific, and much closer to home, Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And really our work in Indonesia has focused on a number of areas. We're helping the National Public Procurement Agency to redesign their standard bidding document, which is used by, I believe, over 700 procurement agencies at national, provincial and local government levels. And this involves simplifying the structure, incorporating design elements and simplifying the language. I'm particularly excited by this because this is a great example of kind of iterative and incremental and open and reusable approaches, which started as an initial experiment in the UK, which is now scaled across the UK as well. And also in Indonesia, we've been working with the Jabbar Digital Service in West Java on their design system, and design being a key aspect of digital government, which is now being implemented with their open data service, and also supporting open ownership. And hi Tom again, in work in Indonesia, for example, through our joint engagements with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights. And then finally, almost finally, we've been working with the UN Women and UN Global Pulse Lab to develop a case study for our digital buying guide, which was done very much collaboratively with those organizations. And the focus of that particular case study is around the value of inclusive design to ensure that cities work for women. And the guide itself is available in Bahasa Indonesia, as well as Spanish and English. So just very briefly on the work we're doing around supplier beneficial ownership, transparency in relation to procurement systems. So we've been developing a prototype tool called Bluetel, which is based on research and analysis in Indonesia, but also Mexico and South Africa. And this focuses on linking procurement system elements like supplier registration and bidding, as well as open data and registers of company beneficial ownership. This particular tool and the approaches help to prevent, detect, and investigate potential corruption and fraud by improving analysis and insights gained from aggregating open data, which is generate different stages of a procurement process and potentially from multiple sources, such as company registers. And Bluetel provides automated alerts on two very important aspects that support corruption and fraud prevention. One is around potential conflict of interest, for example, where cabinet ministers could match the beneficial owners of suppliers bidding for government contracts, and the potential collusion or bid rigging, for example, where multiple companies bidding in a competition could be owned or controlled by the same beneficiaries. So that's particularly exciting work, and we've been working with open ownership, as I mentioned, to translate that prototype tool into Bahasa Indonesia as well. And so I just want to close there, just simply to say that it's, I think the opportunity in this area at the convergence of digital transformation, public sector integrity, and procurement reform, I think is massive opportunities. And I'm delighted and honoured to have the opportunity to work with colleagues in Indonesia and other stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Warren. I'm sorry to make this in such a hurry presentation, but it's all good. You cover everything. Thank you so much. So for the next panelist, I would like to invite Francesco Cecchi. Francesco.
Yeah, hello.
Hello, Francesco. Yes, this is, I think this is your time just to share what UNODC could assist on the reform agenda and procurement system.
No,
thank you, Francesco.
Yeah, thank you, Putri. Thank you to the UK Embassy and to the colleagues in KPK, Bappenas, LKPP for the discussion. It is always very interesting and you know, enticing and to listen to the colleagues and hear what is going on in Indonesia and have a discussion. So it is rather complex to discuss the issue of public procurement in such a short time, but I will just focus on some key elements of the review of implementation of the UN Convention against corruption, and hopefully we can have a brief discussion. So the figures of the state budget and procurements in Indonesia are impressive. So losses due to corruption amount up to 20-25% of the value of the procurements in general. This is an estimation by the World Bank, so we can imagine the amount of funds that are lost because of corruption in public procurement. This is an important moment to discuss this issue. There is an ongoing implementation of the National Strategy for Corruption Prevention, as it was mentioned, and at UNODC, we have already provided input into this process, and of course, we will be glad to continue supporting the implementation of the strategy, also because this constitutes a very good opportunity to support the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, and in particular, with regard to the results of the second cycle of a review that covered the prevention of corruption and, of course, also the issue of public procurement. So just to recap a little bit and maybe highlight some elements of the convention, we have an article, Article 9, that covers public procurement, and the requirements are related to the necessity of public distribution of information related to procurement procedures and contract, establishment in advance of condition for participation, to use objective and predetermined criteria for public procurement decisions, establish an effective system of domestic review, including an effective system of appeal, and of course, introducing measures to regulate matters regarding personnel responsible for procurement, such as declaration of interest. And with regard to the results of the review of implementation, Indonesia has been assessed as largely compliant with the requirements set forth in Article 9. And I must say the country was also praised by the reviewers, for instance, for the utilization of integrity pacts in government procurements and for the establishment of the electronic procurement system, which is by all means a very effective and transparent way of conducting procurement, and also allows for the collection of a large number of data that, as Warren has mentioned, and as I believe our colleagues from Open Contracting Partnership or Open Ownership will discuss, these data are extremely important as they allow for the possibility of utilizing technology for the identification of fraud and corruption. So overall, there's a lot of positives and potential, but nevertheless, there have been some observation by the experts reviewing the implementation of the convention. And first of all, as it was mentioned, the issue of having a overall comprehensive public procurement law, which is not there for the time being. We have, Indonesia has a presidential regulation. There is an open debate on the best ways to regulate the matter, and there are arguments on both sides. But on the specifics now of the elements that were highlighted by the reviewers, there are some issues. So, for instance, the issue of practices of conducting direct procurement and direct appointment, which are reportedly used quite frequently. So we need to understand how to minimize as much as possible the exceptions to the rule of public tenders. So the question is, when the institutions perform direct procurement, is it really strictly necessary? Which are the control applied to these procurements? and are they effective? We have discussed a lot about, you know, the e-procurement and all the regulations that are in place, but if these exceptions exist and they're not controlled, that may constitute a problem. So it would be interesting to hear a little bit on this. Also, you know, a related issue that we find in many countries is the practice of contract splitting, which is to have, instead of a large value for the procurement, a series of smaller contracts, making sure that the value is below the threshold beyond which a public tender is required. So this is one of the most common schemes put in place by administration to avoid an open tender. Sometimes it's just for the sake of you know, efficiency and speeding up things, but sometimes is against a kickback or a bribe. So, and in addition, the issue of direct procurements became a massive problem in many countries, and also in Indonesia, with the introduction of response packages to the COVID-19 crisis. This has been said already. We conducted a study in the countries of the region that showed that in order to respond rapidly to the increasing needs, there has been a relaxation of control and oversights on the one hand, and on the other hand, an increase in public spending to face the crisis, which results in increased risks and increased scope for corruption. So we know all of this. And we sounded the alarm already in February, in March this year on this. Now, Indonesia is having an ongoing investigation against the Minister of Social Affairs. So this is in the public domain. Of course, we need to wait until the end of the investigation to say if there was any wrongdoing. But this is an indication that indeed there are risks, and we should be really careful about the spending on this you know, emergency packages. So another set of considerations that was put forward by the UNCAC review concerned the issue of oversight and auditing. And so we have heard on this by KPK and also by KPP. The procurement system is quite decentralized, as of course as it should be in a country like Indonesia. And the subnational authorities are quite independent in conducting the procurements. Now, one of the observations that was made by the reviewers concerns the fact that supervision and audit are performed internally by procuring institutions. So apparently, and I'm not so sure how the 2018 regulation changed this, but there are no mandatory or periodic external audits, as far as I know. There are financial audits, but they are not an analysis of the procurement process itself or of the outcome. So the recommendation that was put forward is to consider establishing a system for procuring entities to report to a relevant authority such as LKPP on the results of their internal supervision and audits, and consider establishing mandatory or periodic external audits of the public procurement processes. I also would like to mention that the reviewers called for an overhaul of the system with regard to the complaints that bidders may file against a procurement process. So currently the regulations does not spell out clearly the procedure to be followed in reviewing complaints or and sanctions and producing sanctions for violations. So clearer provisions regulating the complaint handling procedures, including an appeal mechanism to an independent body, and sanctions or violations should be considered. Even though it looks like now this has been addressed by the regulation in 2018, I think it's quite clear to me if there is a new appeal system against the procurement decision, or we're talking more about, you know, tips and whistleblower protection in general. Finally, I wanted to highlight the fact that the convention is, of course, an holistic document, and the various measures should not be considered in isolation. So the preventive chapter in particular includes several important elements. So the issue of transparency of beneficial ownership, it was mentioned by several speakers, which is fundamental for the identification of conflict of interest in the conduction of public procurements, among other things. So Indonesia has introduced already a registry of beneficial ownership, and work is ongoing to make it a well-functioning and reliable system. And this is really, really positive. Addressing the issue of conflict of interest in general is also very important. So for instance, so far as I know, there are no specific conflict of interest requirements for procurement personnel. It will be important to establish this requirement also in terms of reporting and training these specific officials that are particularly exposed to corruption. Also, as it was mentioned by Pak Hydrali, there is a need to introduce a system for confiscation of unexplained wealth and addressing the consequences of corruption. For instance, we have to make sure that all contracts that have been obtained through corrupt practices are rescinded, and that responsible actors, including companies, are bound to compensating the victim. Other related issues are, of course, enhancing participation of the civil society, and I mentioned already that the Integrity Pact are used sometimes in Indonesia. Effectively enabling the public to scrutinize and the operation of the government agencies, and also work to be done in the area of access to information. So a lot of challenges, but of course a lot of already good developments, as it was mentioned before. And of course, we as UNODC stand ready to provide assistance. We have conducted a number of training on the identification of red flags for procurement officials. A couple of weeks ago, we had also a training with KPK on big data analysis for the identification of fraud and corruption. And of course, here there is a lot of potential with the various data sets that now exist, with the fact that e-procurement provides a lot of data. So really, as Warren mentioned, a lot of potential here. And we stand really ready to provide assistance, so not only to KPK, but also like to expand our cooperation with LKPP and with the auditors on these matters. So this is it from me, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. So over to you, Putri.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you for covering up the recommendation and observation from the UNCAC Implementation Review of Indonesia. So I would like to add a little bit. So we are actually inviting a representative from KPPU. So we think that problems in competition sometimes in public procurement, because we don't really know who actually behind the companies. So maybe because several times the transparency of beneficial ownership were discussed and mentioned, I would like to a little bit highlight about why we invite KPPU to this discussion. So next panelist, I would like to invite Ben. Hello.
Hi, Putri. Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
Yes, I would like to keep Tom for open ownership as the latest panelist to put everything in place. So I think you could maybe you can share about the open contracting. What is open contracting and what open contracting could contribute to the system. So time and screen is yours, Ben.
Thank you, Putri. So first of all, I'm Ben Ferns, and I'm the Global Head of Infrastructure and Regional Lead for Asia Pacific at the Open Contracting Partnership. Really, really delighted to be here. Thank you so much to Chris and Putri and the team for inviting me. And also great to see old friends and allies here today. So we've heard earlier from Warren and Francesco, and looking forward to hearing from Tom later on as well. So as Putri mentioned, I've been asked to give a rapid fire introduction to what open contracting actually is, and I'll share also some really quick highlights of some of the successes that we've seen from around the world, and finally close with our plans in Indonesia. Now, we've heard a lot today about the intersection between public procurement and corruption, and we know that public procurement is government's #1 corruption risk, and it has been the #1 corruption risk long before the pandemic even began. And you'll see in this slide some of the key facts and figures for the size and scale of public procurement corruption in Indonesia. And I won't go into it in detail because we've heard a lot about it already today from Pak Taufik and Pak Hai, Ibu Sarah, etc. But what I would like to say is to just re-emphasize what Francesco was saying in when he talked about the pandemic exacerbating the challenges that we face in public procurement, and how that has created essentially a Hunger Games scenario where national, state, local governments, public health authorities, hospitals all rush to compete in a mad dash to secure the medicines, the equipment, to build the emergency infrastructure that's needed to deal with this pandemic. And what that has resulted in is we've seen millions and millions of dollars being squandered on questionable purchases. We've seen ventilators that never arrive. We've seen counterfeit masks that aren't fit for purpose. We've seen test tubes for medical purposes that actually turned out to be mini soda bottles or completely useless. In one example, we've seen a raspberry farm in Bosnia winning a $6 million contract to supply ventilators. So clearly the scale of the problem is huge. And the question is, what can we do about it? And we've heard today about some of the great reforms and some of the great work that Indonesia has already started on this journey to address these challenges. And this is also something where open contracting can help. So the question is, what is open contracting? Who are the Open Contracting Partnership? So the Open Contracting Partnership is a global silo-busting organization, and we work with governments, civil society, businesses, academia, media to transform public procurement to deliver better goods, services, and works for everyone. And we do this using the power of open data and combine that with effective participatory mechanisms to help reduce corruption, to improve efficiency, to enhance competition, to get better value for money, and ultimately also build credibility and trust. At the core of our work are two open data standards, the Open Contracting Data Standard, OCDS, and the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard, OC4IDS. And these data standards help stakeholders to publish and use standardized, structured, machine-readable open data in a timely manner. And what this means is that it makes it easier for you to identify what's going wrong and what's going right. It helps you then to identify solutions for fixing those problems and implementing reforms. So it's really, really a very useful tool. Now, open contracting has fast become a global norm, and Indonesia will be familiar with this as one of the founding members of the Open Government Partnership, or OGP. So many in the room here will know that open contracting is increasingly being used as a practical, actionable mechanism to fulfill OGP commitments. So in fact, there are over 189 OGP commitments to open contracting to date, and that's national action plans from all around the world. It's also been endorsed by the G20, the OECD. We work, of course, with multilateral and bilateral agencies such as the World Bank, and of course, our partners here on the call today, the FCDO. And we also complement sister initiatives such as EITI and COST and the beneficial ownership data standards, which Tom will talk about later on. But what does this all mean in reality, and what does it look like on the ground? So for a start, it means that you can build tools. So this is an example from Malaysia where we've been working with Warren and his team in UK GDS on building a red flags for anti-corruption tool, and Warren's team has been doing some really great work with the Silver Eye prototype, and he talked earlier on about Bluetail, and all of these are complementary tools that will help to identify corruption at the earlier stages of the procurement process. So in this tool in Malaysia, it's called Cartology. It helps to identify potential collusion at the tender stages itself. So it's very much preventative in nature. So it tries to catch the bad behavior even before contracts are awarded. And there are, of course, clear links with beneficial ownership, as I mentioned before, because if we can join up these different data sets of procurement and beneficial ownership, we can then start to understand not only which companies are winning contracts, but also who are the owners behind those companies. So that's really important work. I'm going to jump now quickly to an example from Paraguay, where we've been doing a lot of similar work to develop some analytics and visualizations to understand what is going on in procurement. And in this slide, you'll see that we've worked with them to ensure that COVID-19 emergency procurement is published within 10 days of purchase, which is a huge feat. And since then, many irregularities have been identified. And one striking case is the case of a state-owned enterprise purchasing large volumes of tonic water at 5 times the market price. And they did so because allegedly this tonic water could protect against the virus, which of course it couldn't. So you can see that we're already starting, even in the emergency phase, being able to catch these discrepancies and irregularities in procurement. And as a result of these findings, the National Procurement Agency has introduced new rules for reference pricing on emergency purchases, which is a great result. Now, I'm going to jump to an example from the Ukraine. Some of you will have seen this before. It is an oldie, but a goodie. It's one of our flagship projects at the Open Contracting Partnership, where the open contracting approach was used to develop an open, transparent procurement system called Brozoro that joined up all of the procurement processes and made it open so that everyone could easily monitor what was going on. In the first year of operation, this platform helped to save over $1 billion in cost savings from the efficiency gains alone. Thousands of new suppliers flooded the market, and on top of that, the perceptions of corruption also halved. And in this next slide, it's an example from Colombia, where the open contracting approach helped to uncover a price fixing scheme where companies were colluding to keep prices of school meals high. And as a result of this finding, the government then moved to implement a series of reforms, including unbundling contracts so that more suppliers, particularly SMEs, could participate. And as a result, supply diversity drastically increased by over 350%. Prices went down, and more importantly, over 700,000 school meals were delivered every day. So next, I'm going to talk about what this all means for Indonesia and what we're doing in country. So 3 key things that we're doing. The first is that we're developing open contracting tools to improve data use and analytics and insights. We're working obviously with our partners, UNODC and Francesco and his team, to help support the development of red flags for procurement and for anti-corruption in a similar way in which we did that in Malaysia. We're also working with Indonesia Corruption Watch, again, to help them develop some data analytics, some data visualization tools and red flags tools. And of course, we're looking also to expand our open contracting red flags methodology, which is really extensive, but to develop bespoke indicators also for infrastructure procurement, which, as we've heard earlier, is one of the biggest risks for public procurement, especially in the construction stages. So we're really looking to see how we can continue to build out our methodology. Indonesia, as you know, has over $430 billion package for the infrastructure investment for the recovery phase in the next 4 years. The next thing that we're doing is that we're working to support the creation of an enabling environment for open contracting, but for procurement reforms. So for example, we've been working with our partners on the ground to embed open contracting in the next OGP National Action Plan, for example. But it's also really inspired to hear from Pak Taufik and Pak Hai and Ibu Sarah and all the reforms that are going on in Indonesia at the moment. And this is something that we work with our partners on the ground and governments across the world all the time. So if, for example, there was an appetite to to implement a new procurement law in Indonesia, that's something that we would love to help with. We've seen that really robust legal mandates for procurement and open contracting all across the world, including in Panama and in Buenos Aires. We've seen it in Sri Lanka in the national procurement legislations and many other places. And then finally, we also do a lot of work to empower stakeholders to use that data so that you can understand what's working for you in public procurement and what isn't. So we do a lot of trainings and workshops to help build up that capacity. And then looking forward, the final thing that I'll say is that we're also really interested in helping governments particularly, but also all stakeholders to quantify the impacts to help analyze data and quantify the impacts that may already be occurring because of the procurement reforms that you have implemented and because of the data that you may have already put in the public domain. Recently, we did that in Argentina, and we were able to identify that the open infrastructure platform that they developed in the city of Buenos Aires was delivering massive efficiency gains in terms of the time and administrative bureaucracy reduction that was radically improving processes in government. And so if there was an appetite for that here in Indonesia, that's also an offer for us to help, and we'd love to be able to do that. We know that you capture a lot of data in Indonesia, and we'd love to be able to help you make that more open, more usable, and to also understand to what extent that's already driving improvements. Finally, we also have a subnational program in Bandung where we've been working with them to publish open contracting data on the BERMS portal for some years now. That's in collaboration with our partners at the World Bank. And we're looking to scale that up potentially to West Java or other cities or provinces. So again, if there's an appetite there, I would really welcome any advice, recommendations from Pak Taufik, from Pak Hayi, Ibu Sarah, and all the others on the call today on what you would like to see and how we can help you. Now, I'm not going to say more on this. This is the final slide is just to say that I think there's a real window of opportunity for Indonesia to lead by example. Open contracting is a global norm across the world, but there is a gap in Southeast Asia, and I think there's a role for Indonesia to play once again, as Indonesia did with the Open Government Partnership and the OGP process, to lead by example and to show that this is something that can really be done in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for your again, always interesting to see the open contracting system. I mean, and offers about that the data actually can offer transparency. I would like to invite, because I'm sorry, I'm just a little bit rushed in the moderating session because just to ensure that we could finish in 5:20. So I would like to invite our last speakers, Tom Towson from Open Ownership.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone can see that on screen. Firstly, let me thank everyone who's been involved in organising today's session, the British Embassy in Jakarta, Ambassador Jenkins, and the wonderful team there that have been working so hard on the work that we've been doing around Indonesian procurement reform and transparency of beneficial ownership. It's been a really fascinating morning, and I've learned a huge amount from colleagues at the KPK and the LKPP and Bappenas as well, and made a huge number of notes here about the situation in procurement in Indonesia. I'll take a very short amount of time because I know we're rushed this morning, just to tell you a little bit about what we do in the work that we're doing in Indonesia. So firstly, this is who we are and this is our mission and why it matters. And as we come to mark International Anti-Corruption Day tomorrow, let's remember this important fact. Anonymous companies feature in the majority of corruption and criminal scandals. Around 70% of grand corruption cases around the world involve the use of opaque or anonymous companies. They really are the vehicle of choice for hiding illicit activities and money. So at Open Ownership, our mission then is to make beneficial ownership transparency a reality and to tackle corruption and, of course, improve the business environment. And that really matters when we come to think about disclosure and use of beneficial ownership in public procurement. Let's just remind ourselves though, and I think everyone here will be familiar, what do we mean by beneficial owner? Well, a beneficial owner are those people that ultimately own or control a company. They are the people that sit behind the legal and understood director or company secretary, those people that ultimately benefit from a company. This is a new frontier in anti-corruption globally. It's an issue that we have known is a challenge for many, many years. And we're now really at the precipice, the edge of really tackling this problem globally. And it really matters that we do this in every country around the world. Grand corruption is a transnational problem. The international financial system is a global one. We need to understand company ownership at every level and in every country to be able to begin to ensure that we have the infrastructure for integrity that we need to really tackle corruption in the 21st century. Here's what beneficial ownership data can give us in terms of insight into how companies are owned. What you're seeing on screen is data that we've pulled together from available open data sources on beneficial ownership, which we have structured around the beneficial ownership data standard to be able to instantly produce this kind of map of corporate ownership. And what you're seeing on screen is the corporate ownership structure of the Togolese rail system. There's a holding company there, Wasem, that owns the Togolese rail system. And above that, you see this enormously complex ownership chain with companies in the United Kingdom, Panama, and also the Togolese state itself. And because this ownership chain is so big, so complex, we can't even fit all of that on the screen. When we have quality interoperable data about beneficial ownership, this is the insight that we can bring. Very briefly, I want to pick up on where Warren left off about the work that we have been doing alongside GDS and the Ministry of Law and Human Rights in Indonesia. Warren mentioned the Blue Tail prototype, and here are some screenshots from that prototype on screen now. And why I'm so excited about this is, as far as we are aware, the first example of a platform for procurement officials that at the point of supplier registration is bringing together beneficial ownership data and contracting data in a useful and intuitive way to help procurement officials immediately understand how those companies are connected, perhaps to politically exposed persons, but also to other companies that may be bidding for the same tender. And as Warren mentioned, this really is our secret weapon in being able to identify at the earliest available opportunity those conflicts of interest that may exist around particular public procurement and tenders, and also begin to understand whether or not those companies who are bidding on government contracts are perhaps ultimately owned by the same people. And this is one of the important ways that we'll begin to tackle both conflicts of interest and collusion and cartels within public procurement. So globally, we're at a tipping point. Around 90 or so countries around the world have committed to either full or partial disclosure and transparency of beneficial ownership. And you can see there on screen both where those countries are in the world who've committed to that, and also where those red dots are. Where we're working is open ownership to support that reform process, from ensuring that legislation is effectively drafted and that it will deliver what we expect it to, all the way through to supporting the technical implementation of new digital systems. This work that Warren spoke about, bringing that 21st century mindset and application of technology to how government functions. And then finally, through that process, ensuring that the data that comes out is ultimately usable. And I think really importantly, as we're showing there with the Blue Tail example, that it's useful, that we're taking that data and we're placing it in the right way, in the hands of the right people to make use of it and tackle corruption in the ways that we wish to be seen. Finally, I just wanted to mention the three key areas of work that we do. Firstly, it's data standards and principles. We have a data standard now, the beneficial ownership data standard for publishing beneficial ownership data in an effective way. That's now being rolled out in a number of countries around the world to ensure that that data really is useful and interoperable. Secondly, we aggregate all available open beneficial ownership data around the world and put it in one place. You saw that screenshot there of that complex corporate structure. That's all available online at register.openownership.org. And then finally, the technical expertise that we all need to make sure that these complex reforms are well done and well delivered and deliver the kind of impact that we expect them to. One of the other core challenges that we have globally is the number of people who have this technical expertise around the world who are available and skilled to be able to help the delivery of this. A really core part of our mission is making sure that globally the amount of people with this expertise grows so that collectively around the world we have what it takes to deliver these important reforms. I'll stop there. Again, thank you for having me, and I'm really pleased to be here to mark International Anti-Corruption Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm sorry to, but I mean, you cover everything. As for your information, Indonesia already has the President regulation on beneficial ownership transparency. So I hope you know that, and I think the Ministry of Law and Human Rights is progressing to collecting the beneficial ownership information. But I think we need to encourage them to move forward. I mean, to create a sufficient database for everyone to analyze and to use for next analysis. So thank you, Tom. So dear distinguished participants, thank you for your patience to hear all the speakers and panelists on this webinar. So we'll come to the Q&A session. So I hope participants could send their question to the Q&A button, and I will pick the question and share it to the panelists. So we have a first question. The first question from, so we have two questions from Ibu Sinantia Putri. So the question is, if LKPP has its e-procurement system to support all type and kind of national spending procurement, maybe there will be no more direct appointment or swakelola atau penunjukan langsung. Pertanyaannya mungkin bisa dijawab oleh Ibu Sarah. Terus kemudian
I think this question can be answered by Ibu Sarah, and her second question is, has Indonesia already have a national beneficial ownership registry? So I just mentioned that Indonesia has a register, well, at least the Ministry of Law and Human Rights is collecting the data based on their mandate by virtue of Presidential Regulation 13/2018, even though it's not yet publicly available. So to Ibu Sarah, you can answer the question of our participant here about the or whether Indonesia's e-procurement system can accommodate all kinds, all types of public procurement, and if that's so, perhaps it can minimize the use of direct appointment and also the in-house procurement or self-management procurement. I think the self-management type is seen as prone to corruption. Thank you, Putri, for conveying that question. So if we consider the mechanism or methodology of procurement or method of procurement, I think we cannot ignore what is the trend currently. I think other than some of the pre-identified methods, for example, the tendering or direct purchasing or direct procurement, the self-management method goes hand in hand with the other methods. In the local level, in villages, for example, they use self-management or in-house procurement very frequently. So if we eliminate in-house procurement entirely, our concern is that perhaps the system will not be truly fit for the needs of our people. So if we recognize that there is a need for self-management, then we can maintain that method. The next question is, of course, how can we control the system to make it fair and clean and transparent? There are some things that we can do to that end, and what LKPP is now developing is by building a system. We believe that our system, our electronic bidding system, is not yet comprehensive, and so that's why there are some methods that are still being done manually outside of the electronic system. So we are still developing the system, refining it. Uh, at the end of the day, we want to have a system that can provide accurate information, widely available, accurate and reliable data that we can use. And in addition to that, we also conduct monitoring and supervision on procurement process. So if the question is whether after we have an electronic bid, complete electronic bidding system, can we then eliminate the in-house procurement method? I don't think so, because in reality, this is the methodology that is being used by many people in the local level. I think the question should be, how can we minimize corruption or corrupt practices in the self-management method? And the answer to that is by building a better system so that we can provide a more robust monitoring. Also, in the presidential regulation, there are articles, for example, Article 76, that stipulates that the head of local government is obligated, so this is not an option, is obligated to supervise procurement from the planning phase. So the question is whether this obligation is being fulfilled or not, because without fulfilling that obligation, we cannot control what is happening in the procurement cycle. And so we need to improve not just our system, but our monitoring methods. That would be my answer, Putri. Thank you. Thank you, Ibu Sarah. And it's very interesting to hear about this system. And allow me to ask the question, since we don't have any other questions yet. You highlighted about that the biggest challenge that you highlighted was attitude. So my assumption that would be the attitude of the procurement officers, or perhaps the leader of the procurement unit. And as we have seen, we learned from recent cases, I think we can say that there's indications of significant lack of control and conflict of interest, and that companies in these cases that won the tender are actually controlled by the relatives or associates of the suspect, and that is the minister in this case, or at least that's what is being reported in the media. So I would like to ask more about the registry of beneficial ownership, and speaking about that in the context of our public procurement. If we can have that registry, perhaps we can lower some corruption risks. Or perhaps you can also elaborate about the slide that you didn't have time to elaborate, because I would like to know whether we can link the beneficial ownership registry with the public procurement system, and thereby we can minimize the risk of bid rigging, because it is one of the method being used in public contracting fraud. And so perhaps, let's say, 5 companies can agree that they were going to bid in a tender, and then they can do bid rigging, bid rotation. So perhaps you can address that question first while we're waiting from our participants. Thank you. And your question, Putri, actually emphasizes the lesson learned about data integration and how vital data integration is when a company is officially registered with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, and then they amend, for example, their company deeds. In a public procurement process, if we cannot be able to be connected with the ministry, if we cannot get data directly from the ministry, well, there's going to be a time lag. If we can have connected system, I can perhaps get the data within just 5 minutes. But without having a connected system, I need to uh, proceed with official correspondence method. I may need to peruse lots of documents to get to the relevant ones. So it's going to be a delay of time. And secondly, there's also a challenge on our data with the ministry may be different because I only get data or information from the potential supplier or a participating vendor in a tender. So you can imagine how easily it would be and how accurate our decision making can be if we have a unified database. If we talk about the beneficial ownership of a company and we get the data from the unified database of the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, then I think a lot of problems can be solved, but that is not the case today. That's going to be a lot of challenges if we have only partial systems being set up and we have all of us have our own different systems. We do have the VMS, the vendor management system, but the VMS right now only has data of vendors that have participated in past tender projects. But if the vendor doesn't take the initiative to update their own data where there are changes, then we wouldn't get updated data either. So it's really, your questions really goes to the heart of the problem. We have no option that we have to build a one data system. You can call it anything, but what's important is to have unified database that can ensure accuracy and data reliability. And then in terms of conflict of interest, I think based on the regulation itself, our regulation is clear, sufficiently clear, that if a company or individual is part of ownership in another company, then the other company cannot participate in the bidding. But again, we need to look at what kind of information that we get in the procurement system. Sometimes there are changes in ownership information. For example, you own one company, but then you resigned or you transfer your ownership, and this new owner is part or owns other companies. And these companies are affiliated with one another. So this is a challenge for us in procurement when we have to work with insufficient data and we realize that the risk is so great. That is where we should be looking at potential avenues for collaboration. We have these these parties that want to support us from the UK Embassy, from the open ownership, from open contracting partnership, and but now we also need to start saying that public procurement has to be a lot more transparent, and it's in this good data is indispensable. I agree with that, Ibu. So I think it's a very important note for future improvement. So I have a request from Ibu Bern because she has a question.
Thanks, Putri. So this is a question for, I guess, either Pak Taufik or Ibu Sarah. I was really impressed to see all of the great work that you've already been doing on procurement reform and with your EGP systems. And I really especially loved looking at the architecture that shows the entire ecosystem of public procurement in Indonesia. What I'm really interested to know is whether or not you have any plans for explicitly incorporating open data as part of those reforms? And if yes, what would that look like? And what do you see the role of open data is in as part of your reform process?
Bisa langsung gitu Bu Putri?
Silakan Ibu langsung dijawab.
Saya mohon dikoreksi Bu kalau
So,
apa namanya.
correct me if I'm wrong or I misunderstand the question. My understanding about the question is how can we integrate the architecture in terms of reporting? Is that correct? Is my understanding correct, or do you have a different question?
Ben?
So my question to clarify is really that I'm interested to know how you will include open data requirements, or if you will include open data requirements as part of the public procurement reform process. So, for example, if there's going to be a new regulation or presidential commitment, how will you include open data in that? And what do you think the role of open data is in the Indonesian context, and how it can help the great work that you're already doing?
Oke, baik Bu. Terkait dengan open data.
Thank you. So with respect to open data or open contracting, I think we can start with the architecture that I displayed, because data can be provided from the planning phase. The challenge is when we talk about planning, our system is called SIRUP, that's the planning system. The challenge is there are just so many systems being developed in one region. For example, one region might have 3 systems. They have a system from the National Audit Board, system from LKPP, system from the Interior Ministry. So the data have to be input multiple times because these systems are not being integrated or connected. So we can already see the potential error there by multiply data transfer, and people are not happy that they have to input the same data several times. So I think there's an opportunity for improvement, naming we have the data from the time we receive the budget plan, what are the budget lines. We need to have a standardized methodology as well to process data, to process contract, to manage contract. It's also very important. And then we can generate reporting. As for reporting, as per today, we are unable yet to carry out an in-depth analysis. We can only talk about the statistics, for example, X thousand of suppliers or vendors that are in a system, or X thousands of contracts. But we cannot do beyond that, because as I mentioned, if we can have a fully connected cycle, for example, connected to open contracting, perhaps we can have a backbone in the system only for public procurement, we can focus on government spending without having to sending letters back and forth with the Ministry of Finance, for example. This is something that we cannot do as of now. Yes, we can see price trend. We want to see price trend, we want to see price trend, but we cannot do that now, for example. If you ask me, let's say medical equipment for MRI that we purchased last year with specific spec and specific price, and you want me to compare with the price and spec today, I cannot tell you that information because I don't have a way to track that information. I don't have a way to identify the real supplier. So we're missing a lot of analysis opportunity. My hope is that if we want to discuss open contracting, open data, I think we want to put those two in the central area of the public procurement process. We also need to build a business process that can incentivize people to use that business process, because we can develop a good system, but if we cannot roll out that system, that you cannot facilitate our colleagues to use the system, well, they're going to leave it because they don't see the incentive to use the system no matter how good that is. They will see that, oh, we have our own different needs, we won't use your system. So the first thing that we have to do is we want to, yes, we need to incorporate open data, open contracting in our procurement cycle, and then develop a business process in a way that will incentivize our officers to use it. And then we can generate a legal instrument, I would say. I think realistically, that's what we can do. In my opinion, if we start from regulation or drafting regulation or law, people will say that uh, regulation as the driver, but we want to create needs. The driver should be their needs instead of the regulation. Thank you, Ibu Sarah. So, i- in open data, I think if we we cannot have compliance with based on regulation, that perhaps we can just open data and to share data with the civil society or other actors. We have a very interesting question from participant Mr. Yusuf Budiman. This question to Pak Hai, and Pak Yusuf Budiman is handling a bribery case on public procurement involving a local government official up to the region level, and they collaborate with the local parliament. I think this sounds like a familiar case. So I would like to know the strategy of LKPP or the strategy in the Stranas, in the national strategy, to prevent this kind of case. This is not just about the attitude of procurement unit, but it is also involving uh, decision makers in budgeting and public procurement. So Pak Hai, perhaps you can explain to us a little bit more. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih Bu Putri. Pertanyaan dari Pak Yusuf tadi kalau saya nggak keliru.
Thank you,
Betulkah
Putri.
yang
Thank you for the question.
awal tadi saya sampaikan bahwa tekanan besar
And
terhadap
as I
barang dan jasa ini
mentioned, the
ya, intervensi
pressure to
internal
public procurement system is the
yaitu
internal and
melalui
external
proses
intervention.
parlemen.
So external intervention, one of them comes from the parliament, national and
Kebijakan
subnational.
atasan langsung
And then internally,
kewajiban
pressure can comes from, undue influence can come from our superior, or as Pak Yusuf mentioned, the head of region or someone from the regional secretariat.
sebagai atasan langsung.
So where there's
Dan ini
undue influence by the superiors, it's going to be difficult
termasuk
for the regular
Komisi
officers
3
to
DPR
counter that,
juga
because
tetap
they are not
dalam
in the
proses
same
itu
position.
sebabnya dalam kasus
They're not in the position to, for
LKPP ini
example, to
melakukan
fight
KPK.
back.
Ini
So
jelas
this is
sekali
also
melakukan PPK di situ
uh,
sebagai pejabat pembuat
the case
peraturan
similar to what is being
dalam
handled by
pedoman
KPK right now. There's
pasal
clearly
3.
an abuse
Nah,
in the part of the
kasus
commitment
ini
making official in the
dari
procurement process. And this
pusat
is
sampai ke daerah
so
banyak.
many cases that
Nah,
this is similar that we have
tugas
seen
apa
from the national to
peran dari
subnational level.
untuk
So what are
mengatasi
our
tadi
strategies
penegakan
to
aturan
prevent
sama
this
dalam
kind
satu
of
kasus yang
incident?
presentasi saya
I've
itu
mentioned in my
ada
presentation
3
that
strategi
the national
untuk
strategy identifies three things
cara-cara
to
seperti Pak Yusuf
inhibit
sampaikan
or
ini.
to
Pertama
filter
itu
these
adalah
kind of
kita
methods. First
bersama-sama
of
dengan
all,
KPP
together with
mendorong
LKPP, of course,
implementasi
we encourage,
pengadaan barang dan jasa ini
we
menjadi
urge reform
independen,
on procurement
menjadi
services. We want them to be
lembaga yang
independent
mandiri, menjadi
units.
lembaga yang
We
struktural.
want them to be a
Jadi tidak
structural
masalah
unit.
lembaga
In the
pengadaan barang dan
past,
jasa yang penting itu.
PSU, a public
Kurang begitu
procurement
diperhitungkan,
service unit,
kurang
uh,
begitu diperhitungkan.
doesn't
Sebab kalau dia kuat,
enjoy a lot
dia
of
bisa
attention,
intervensi. Saya
and
kira kasusnya
they're
seperti itu.
not
Seperti itu.
prioritized for a
Dan kita
reform
tahu,
or
maka
capacity
kita
strengthening.
memperkuat
And we realize that,
di
so
dalam
that's why one of our
menyelesaikan
strategies
pengadaan
is we
barang
want
dan
to
jasa
strengthen
dari
the
level
procurement
pusat
service
sampai ke
units
daerah.
at
Nah,
both
untuk
national and
orang-orang yang ada
subnational
di
level.
dalam unit kita
And
ini ada
the
beberapa
officers in
orang-orang
those
yang
units
tadi yang Ibu Putri
are
sampaikan tadi
not only, as Ibu Sarah said, are not only experts in procurement or certified procurement officers, but they are there because they have passed certain competency criteria. And one of the things we need to assess is their integrity. How can they develop a procurement SOP or procurement strategy on the basis of integrity? This is a criteria that we introduce to the working system of a PSU and their leadership. We elevate their status as a civil servant uh, to make them more empowered and to make them less susceptible to undue influence. For example, we cannot make them as a echelon 1 or echelon 2 officials, but at least they have an equal level to the regional secretary, for example, or with the general secretary of a region, so that we can minimize influence from other parties and to order the PSU to award a project to certain companies. So that's one strategy. And secondly, we want to, well, in our opinion, it's very important to have the vendor management system where it also assesses the performance of the vendors and suppliers. As I mentioned, if we want to use the VMS, a globally recognized model of VMS, then the vendors in our system called CCAP should be vendors who have passed integrity test and they have recognized performance level. Their integrity level is also recognized. So new companies, not all companies, not any companies can enter the CCAP system because they need to be able to demonstrate integrity and competency. This is our filter, our way to filter vendors, to avoid, for example, a party leadership establishing a company in a region in Indonesia, participating in a tender, and then they win. And the company may have just been established within 3 months. So the CCAP or the VMS can prevent this kind of incident. As I mentioned, I think 55% of the parliamentarians are business owners. How can they avoid these vulnerabilities to corruption? Can we make sure that they avoid conflict of interest? Perhaps they in a conflict of interest scenario, they can, for example, manipulate budget or pricing. But if our CCAP system, as we aspire, can be a robust system, we can prevent those kind of cases where an entirely new company enters a tender and then win because of certain influence. And thirdly is to have internal auditors or APIP, and they are the officers that we rely on to supervise procurement process, and they should be involved since the planning stage. Uh, so from the time PSU is developing the reference price and then the selection of vendor, these stages or the whole cycle of procurement process should involve an internal supervisor or auditor or APIP, not the past version of APIP, but a new version of APIP who have integrity, who are competent and professional. But regardless of the system, mechanism, and method that we develop, all of that comes down to integrity of the individuals. even though we can have a very simple method of procurement, direct appointment, direct procurement, if the officers have integrity, they are honest, they are trustworthy, then any method of public procurement can go out, can be happening as intended. And but if we cannot have integrity in any level, then we will continue seeing the same problems in our public procurement cycle. Uh, so even despite reform process, we can only perhaps minimize 30 to 40% of the problems. The rest of it depends on the people, the officers of public procurement system. So one addition, in the national strategy, we are also developing budget planning integration, so electronic budget planning integration. So Sarah mentioned about SIRUP. LKPP is ready with its electronic system, but we are now trying to choose whether what electronic systems that we want to use, whether it is under the Interior Ministry, or I think Ibu Sarah, based on our recent assessment, we want to go with a certain electronic system that we have deemed comprehensive and will only require minimum refinement. And we want to integrate SIRUP in that system. So we plan to have an electronic government system that integrates, including SIRUP, also integrated with the one data Indonesia. So we're improving end to end of the whole process. Hopefully we can complete this within 2-3 years. Thank you.
Terima kasih Pak Hai, luar biasa. Ibu Sarah ada tambahan Ibu? Ini menarik sekali nih tadi.
Thank you Pak Hai, that's amazing. Ibu Sarah, you have any?
Terima kasih Ibu Putri. Saya prinsipnya
Thank you, Ibu
sama.
Putri. In principle, I agree with Pak Hai, but I just would like to add something. What you mentioned earlier, that if our system is not ready to monitor or to control everything, then I think it will be better for public to control it. And I think we can see everything from SIRUP. If the government officials are consistent in filling it out, then public will have the ability to monitor. For instance, like a couple of years ago, one of our local government want to buy elevators. So that's actually questionable because the allocation is actually to the governor's house, while we know there is no elevator shaft in the governor's house. If we do not open this kind of data to the public, then the public will not be able to control this. And I agree that above all, we need human with or individuals with integrity. We have already prepared the system, we have already prepared the national strategy that is comprehensive. So what we can do now is we can promote the syrup. People should be able to access syrup, and also the providers can also prepare themselves by accessing the data from syrup. That's Putri. And the second thing that I would like to raise, I am afraid I will forget this. Our discussion have been very interesting, and there are many good aspects that we learned from this discussion. So I hope that the result of this discussion can be shared to us via Bappenas, the National Development Planning Agency, so that we can also put this into our improvement agenda. Like for instance, Pa Francesco raised about the law, the legislation, and in his remarks, Pa Collie also mentioned about that. So maybe we can have this as the recommendation of this workshop or this webinar. Okay, thank you, Ibu. We will summarize everything, and we will send the recommendation to Bappenas CC LKPP. I'm very happy to see that we have positive response from the government, because this COVID-19 situation have forced us to make a faster but also more efficient procurement process. We have one comment from Ibu Hani Rosidai. She comments that the BO registration is available in Indonesia and can be accessed through bo.ahu.go.id, where public can register their beneficial ownership data. However, this register is not accessible to public currently. So her question is, when can we start to integrate the LKPP data with the BO data? So maybe this can be our future discussion between LKPP and Ministry of Law and Human Rights and also KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission, to integrate all the data. So I think this is the last comment, and it's already 38 minutes past 5 now. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, resource persons, panelists, for staying with us until the end of this webinar discussion. And as Ibu Sarah said earlier, there are many takeaways from this discussion, and I think this should be summarized and submitted to the authorities formally. Now, I would like to also ask Chris Agus to contribute to prepare the summary. Chris?
Ya, terima kasih. Putri. Thank you everybody for a fascinating webinar. I think all of us learned a lot. I mean, we're all working in this space, but things have been changing quickly. And I think it's also very useful to bring in the delivery partners and organizations that we're partnered with, UNODC, GDS, Open Contracting Partnership and Open Ownership, to give that perspective on certain solutions that can be worked with LKPP, KPK, Bappenas and other parts of the Indonesian government to continue this agenda. I think it's clear that there are still significant challenges ahead. No one would deny that. But there's an appetite and there's a certain regulatory framework that exists that can be modified and supported to continue making public procurement and beneficial ownership more transparent, and therefore contributing to the corruption prevention agenda. So that's what we're interested in as the UK, working with Indonesia in the anti-corruption program, and all of our partners that have spoken are driving that forward. So that's what we want to continue doing. That's the plan, and we look forward to that journey. Also want to thank all of the speakers again for their time, and especially you, Putri, for moderating and doing different host work today. So that was really important. And it's good to see you, in the still in the anti-corruption world, even in a different organisation. So that's great. Thanks again, and we'll keep on this conversation in future events.
Okay. Yeah, we should keep the point takeaways from this discussion to be delivered to Bappenas and LKPP, so we can follow up recommendation and items that we could collaborate together with the government. I think it would be a good plan or a good collaboration between UNODC and UK Embassy for future years. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for the for your time and participation in this webinar, and I hope we could meet again in different webinars, and looking forward to hear your comments, input, and question about anti-corruption programs in Indonesia. See you again.
Terima kasih semua.
Terima kasih Ibu. Terima kasih Bapak.
Terima kasih. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.